Zhu Xiaotu explained that they wanted to film 30 episodes, each about a minute long, and they would be paid 1,000 rubles per episode as the main characters, while the others would get 200 per episode, and they'll pay 30,000 for rent. The guy asked how he felt about that plan. Huang Xibo said it wasn't much, and he didn't need the money, but they couldn't force him to work for free. Tycoon was surprised by this turn of events. If they wanted to pay him a salary, something seemed wrong, and he needed to think about it. We're not expecting an urgent research conference. Tycoon mentioned that they hadn't met in a while and asked them to take advantage of the opportunity to have a proper meeting. They gave Huang Xibo 1,000,000 yuan and told him to invest it in any industry he wanted, but he uses the money to pay their salaries. What do they think about that? Their own money comes back to them. It's as if they hired themselves. The guy couldn't understand what all this nonsense was about. He asked to wait a little while. Tycoon asked if the system account would be transferred to their personal account. He tried to weigh the pros and cons and kept thinking about it. He asked the system if they could receive this salary, and the wealth conversion system replied that any reward for the work performed by the owner is considered legal earnings. The point is that system funds cannot be maliciously converted. At the same time, the reward must be reasonable, according to market standards. Tycoon, looking at the guys, said that the filming location would be free. As for the salary, he agreed. Zhu Xiaotu thanked the boss and said that in this case they would sign a contract with him. Even if it's just a formality, it's better if he reads it. Compensation for contract termination is triple his salary. Tycoon replied that if it was just a formality, there was no point in reading it. He thought about Huang Xibo's company, which was called the Feiwan Zone. Zhu Xiaotu handed the contract to the boss, who took it with a smile. A good name. A fast flight leading south. That's a good sign. The boss asked me to clarify again whether their short film was called a surprise. The guys turned in unison towards the boss and answered in unison that they did not. Tycoon was puzzled and was now extremely confident that he would lose money. Huang Xibo told his boss that they would go. They needed to start writing the script quickly so they could begin filming. The boss said goodbye to him and the guys left. When the door closed, the boy smiled. He thought about how the system was taking care of him. He'd gotten a personal job, and now 30,000 would go into his pocket. He tried so hard to lose money and only made 20,000. He needs to somehow use this in the future. Zhu Xiaotu explained to Huang Xibo that since Boss Tycoon was fully supportive, he thought they would succeed. But first, I need to finish writing the script. The guy completely agreed with his friend. He was reading something, peering at his projects. But he always disliked it. His partner was also sitting intently reading. They simultaneously threw the unwritten sheets of paper onto the table and exclaimed that it was not interesting. They decided it wasn't creative at all, and that it was just rubbish and wouldn't work. They realized that these scenarios lacked feeling, and then Huang Xibo suddenly exclaimed that he knew. Zhu Xiaotu was immediately interested in what he had come up with. Then the boy asked if he remembered what their boss, Tycoon, had asked. The boy frantically began to recall. He was talking about checking again. Is their short film called Surprise? Zhu Xiaotu was delighted by the thought and said that it was indeed so. He asked if the film would be called Surprise. Huang Xibo replied that that was exactly it. That was his hint, and that was exactly what they were missing. Zhu Xiaotu said they were filming the life of Tycoon's boss. They wouldn't be able to show anything special if they filmed sequentially, like in a documentary. If they want to impress the viewer in 1 minute, they need to do something unexpected. There have to be plot twists. Huang Xibo said that now they have a direction, and then the finishing touches will come. They need to create an impression of Tycoon's boss, while simultaneously writing out the plot twists. Zhu Xiaotu became interested, and said that he would add some more sarcasm and black humor. And so, February 9th arrived. Employees sat at their desks, staring at their computer monitors. One of the guys was looking at the computer and simultaneously gobbling up food. Another carried various instruments, and all this was done very quickly and confidently. Huang Xibo and Zhu Xiaotu prepared for their first filming with enthusiasm and amicability. Zhu Xiaotu told his boss that this episode would be simple. It would only require a couple of shots and no lines, so he wouldn't even need to read the script. They'd simply add the voiceover during editing. Tycoon was surprised and asked if he really didn't need to say anything or read the script, and how that even worked. The guy replied that he was already busy, so they didn't want to waste his time. In the first shot, he'll be sitting on the couch in his office. You'll need to raise your hand and look at your wristwatch. Then in the next frame, he'll be holding a game magazine and will flip to a poster of the game. He must point to it with his finger while filming. Then he smiles slightly and looks into the distance when he approaches the window. It is necessary to pretend that he is in deep thought, looking ahead with wide open eyes. And finally, the first footage was filmed. Pei Qian approached the guys with a slight smile. Xiao Cha told his boss that filming was over, and he could continue working. Pei Qian thanked the guys for their work, and wondered whether they had filmed at all and what kind of filming it was. A short film shot like this, especially without a script, will definitely lose money. The boy wiped the sweat from his brow and decided they were being too frugal. Even now, they were using his things for props. Then he looked at his watch and wondered, why was he looking at it in the first scene? He was looking at it while sitting on the couch. He couldn't understand why he had to pretend to be in deep thought. Pei Qian tried to figure out their script and their plan for further filming. He ran to the door and decided that things were bad and something was definitely going to happen. He ran after the boys, apparently to tell them something or ask them questions. He quickly opened the door and called director Zhu Xiaoqi. He asked him to wait a little. The guy immediately turned to his boss and asked what had happened. Was something wrong? Pei Qian asked the boy to look at the film script and reach for his notes. Zhu Xiaoqi immediately handed over the script and said that if that was all, they would go and edit it. The boy agreed and said goodbye to the director. He headed to his office to quickly study the script. Pei Qian began to flip through the pages and read about the life of boss Pei Qian. It was written that he looked at his watch, not to check the time, but to subtly show them that he was rich. He bought the Rolex on a whim and saved up the first 200,000 for research and development. By the time he handed over the assignments to the intern an hour earlier, the money had dwindled by 3/4. He looked at the resource station's report and was delighted. Subordinates can be relied upon, and now the intern only had 50,000 left. When he learned that the 50,000 would be used for research and development instead of confusion, his expression showed doubt and surprise. He finally gave in, and it's so hilarious. After all, he's the king of this market, and he seems to have tasted defeat. He never thought he'd end up creating a game where players would spend money. They enjoy a boring life and have to drive for 8 hours. In 2 weeks, their earnings jumped over 200,000. The boy was shocked by what he had just read. It was a mixture of Zhu and Dan's boring life and a surprise, but they said they wouldn't film the surprise. Pei Qian wondered what to do. Surprise and the boring life of Zhu and Dan are successful short films. This scenario is very similar to them. They are bound to become popular. The boy continued to stare at the script about his own life, which was titled The Life of Boss Pei. Pei Qian contacted the system and said he wanted to cancel his investment. He asked if he could get his million back. The system indicated that he must have a valid reason to return the investment. Otherwise, it would be considered a violation of the rules. Pei Qian realized he didn't have a valid reason. Huang Xibo either takes a bribe or finds Zhu Xiaoqi ugly. But no, he's changed his mind, because neither of those are valid reasons. The boy clutched his head in his hands and clenched his teeth. He tried to calm down and find a way other than returning the money. He would no longer play the leading role. He'll say he's busy and decline the offer. The film might not be popular if they change the actor. But wait a minute, the contract termination compensation is triple the salary, and that's 90,000. Where could he find 90,000 in compensation? Pei Qian was very angry and began to wonder what to do. He asked the system if he could use funds from the system account for compensation. The wealth conversion system explained that since the contract is a personal contract and all income will be the owner's personal income, the compensation should also be paid from the personal account. The boy was simply shocked by such a statement from the system, and his eyes widened several times. He said he couldn't just sit around doing nothing. He could spend the money on internet cafes and games. The boy decided to tell Lu Ming Liang to work harder on tomorrow's voiceover. He needed to add some mockery to the player. He started heading towards the door to get to his office faster. Pei Qian ran as fast as he could, and the next day he was already on the set. The guy asked his employees to handle the filming tools more carefully. Xiaoqi handed his boss a new script. Pei Qian was already sitting on the couch, a sheet of paper in his hands. The director explained to his boss that yesterday's footage was almost finished. They were preparing for meetings with streaming platforms to discuss partnerships, advertising, and pricing. But no need to worry, he knows a senior employee at the Potato Network. The plan was to give out 9 consecutive bonuses to hard-working employees. As expected, the last time wasn't a coincidence. Xiaoqi told his boss that he didn't look very well and asked if his work was exhausting him. The boy asked him not to worry and explained that he could not continue filming. Xiaoqi replied to the boss that he understood him and asked the guys to film quickly. The boy thought for a moment and a brilliant idea popped into his head. He might just be working poorly and slowly. He uses all his bad acting skills to ruin this movie. Oh, that intense gaze, that emotionless look, that pouting. Better to cry than laugh, self-support, soul-devouring. Zhu Xiaoci pointed the camera at the boss and asked if they could start filming. The boss replied that of course they could. He thought that since he wasn't a professional actor, if he did something clumsily, Zhu Xiaoci would have nothing to complain about. The guy kept pointing the camera at his boss and asked him to make a neutral expression. The boy listened to the director and did what he asked. Zhu Xiaoci asked his boss for one more shot. Now you need to smile a little, but so that it doesn't seem that he is emotionless. Everything is going well, and now he asks to include a little confusion in his gaze. He asked Boss Pei to pat the employee on the shoulder, but without any emotion. After this, the boy asked to give the employee the card and also to do this without emotion. And then the director exclaimed that everything was fine and ready. Filming was finished. The boy shook his boss's hand and smiled happily. He said that Boss Tycoon is simply a great actor and that he is playing himself. He's very good at playing a character who appears emotionless on the outside, but is brimming with emotion on the inside. He exceeded all expectations. Xiaoci told the boy that they would go and film the last episode before the new year tomorrow. The short film is sure to become popular thanks to his acting skills. Tycoon didn't expect this turn of events and thought about how he could show his acting skills and why he felt something was wrong. Tycoon was left alone in his thoughts and decided that no acting skills were required of him. The only thing that matters is the narrative. He's the main actor. Nothing more than a blank. All that remains is to hope for a miracle from a game developer and a profitable internet cafe. A profitable internet cafe interior plan. The employee told the boss that the initial plans were ready and he could see if he liked them. Pei Chen replied that this was what was expected from old Ma Yan. I did everything he asked and didn't skimp. 3 months rent plus a deposit, 50 computers at 26,000 each, and the total comes to over $1 million. Add in other expenses, and the initial outlay comes to around $3 million. The more expensive it is, the more he'll lose, and that's simply amazing. Tycoon was pleased with this plan. He wrote to his boss that he wouldn't go home for the new year, but would stay here, oversee the renovations, and try to finish them as quickly as possible so he could start early. Tycoon replied that it was not necessary because if he did not want to go home for the new year, it did not mean that the workers did not want it. After all, it was his friend supporting him. The more serious old Ma Yan was, the more likely something would go wrong. Suddenly there was a knock on his door, and the boss asked him to come in. Pei Chen said that he looked at the game developer's plan and added a few more lines of voiceover. He asked the boy if he'd looked at it. The employee replied that he had and asked how he liked it. But he feels like the voiceover goes a bit overboard with the mockery. Pei Chen lowered his head and decided that this was very wonderful, because this is exactly what he wanted. The boy asked Lu Ming Liang not to worry and to continue using this plan. But their next step was to draw it. He asked them to remember that he needed the most expensive animation and design plan. The boy was very surprised and thought about how the players would be humiliated and mocked. They would become enraged and want to deal with them, and he hoped they would cope. The employee exclaimed to the boss that he understood. They would be diligent in developing the visuals and perfect them, just like Juan had done. He asked whether to invite the artist to meet him once he had decided on a candidate. Tycoon replied that it wasn't necessary. He reflected on how he knew nothing about art, and so Lu Ming Liang walked out the door, very thoughtful and serious about his work. He thought that his boss was not only demanding about the quality of the painting, but also believed in him. He was very keen not to let his boss down and thought that he had to complete all of Boss Pei Chen's tasks perfectly. It doesn't fit, even though it looks good. The style is too bland, and this one is too realistic and doesn't fit the game either. The boy finally reached the right option and exclaimed that it was very good. This isn't the artist who worked on the Ghostly General, or maybe it is. He worked with Boss Pei Chen before he was trained in all styles, and he is simply perfect. It was February 12th. It was cold outside, and the enormous high-rise buildings towered skyward. A young man with a suitcase in his hands went out into the street and began to stop a taxi approaching him. He thought everything was over at the company. 7 days off. But he'd have to hide the fact that he had the company from his parents for a while. Otherwise, how can he explain to them where he got $50,000 to start a company? Besides, my father is old-fashioned and doesn't approve of games. If he finds out he has a game development company, I'll be fine. It had been night outside for a long time already, and the boy tried to carefully open the door so as not to wake his parents. But the mother heard the door and immediately asked if her son had arrived home. The father was also sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea and exclaimed, looking at his son, that their scoundrel had arrived. The boy walked into the house and greeted his parents. He explained to his mom and dad that he was already home. Suddenly he heard a sound. The television was on in his parents' room. The news broadcast was already ending, and the presenter thanked the viewers for watching. The son suggested that his parents upgrade their television. He explained that their current TV was too small. But my father asked why he needed to change it, since it was also working fine. Besides, he and his mother don't usually watch TV. Then the son asked about the washing machine, whether he should upgrade it. But the father, looking down, answered his son that it was very expensive. Besides, there were no problems with it. He asked what they would do with the old one if they bought a new one. The son replied that they would just throw it away and he could buy it and not have his father worry. Then his father immediately cast a surprised glance at him and asked why he needed to buy all this and where he got the money. He had just arrived. The father asked his son to change his clothes and wash his hands so he could sit at the table. The father sipped his tea and looked at his son very intently. The boy began to explain that he had accepted an invitation to star in a short series, and the director pays him $30,000. Pei-chan thought that thank God he had prepared in advance. The father closed his eyes and told his son he was too young to brag to him. And what TV series were they paying him $30,000 to star in? They'd better pay him that much. Pei-chan asked his father if there was any reason why he shouldn't receive his $30,000 salary. His father replied that it was impossible and that he would only believe it when he showed him the series. But the boy answered his father that he was afraid that he had not yet been loaded. The mother asked them to stop chatting and gather around the dinner table quickly. After all, the food had been ready for a long time. The father and son immediately headed to a large table on which stood a variety of dishes. The mother peeled an apple with a sharp knife and handed it to her son. She asked Pei-chan when this series he was talking about would be shown. The boy told his mother that even if she asked, how would he know? Then the boy's mother asked him to ask the director, and he immediately pulled out his phone. The director told his boss that it had been uploaded yesterday and he could find it in the comedy section, called The Daily Life of Boss Pei. Pei-chan was very surprised that the video was already on the internet, and he ran to get his laptop. The boy told his parents that he would bring the laptop here for them to look at. When he turned on the laptop, he couldn't understand what was happening, and beads of sweat began to run down his cheeks. It was only uploaded yesterday, but it already has over 200,000 views. Isn't that pretty fast? Father folded his arms across his chest and read the title, Boss Pei's Daily Life. The boy explained to his father that this was the title of a TV series. He plays the role of a company boss. The father replied that the young man was unreliable in running business. He did not look like the boss of the company. He looks at his role, but not at the time they show. That's how the series began. The parents didn't expect that to be it. Pei-chan explained that it was a short film and he could watch it again. They could watch together, and he'd go about his business. The mother told her husband that his son had played the role of the boss perfectly. It looked so natural, as if he actually owned his own business. The man asked in what sense it was magnificent. His face was simply emotionless. Had she ever seen a boss like him? She replied that he spoke as if he had met many big bosses in his life. Pei-chan had already gone to his room. He was left alone and turned on the computer. The boy sat gloomy at the table. He noted that looking at the comments, it becomes clear that this style is popular among people. He began to reassure himself. No matter how many views the show got, they were meaningless, since it didn't even have commercials. And so, after the new year, on February 22nd, Pei-chan decided the situation was dire. And each of the 3 episodes uploaded since then has garnered over 500,000 views. A guy told Zhu in his head that the recent episodes had become popular. He asked if they would celebrate their success. Another employee asked Zhu, the director, for a few more scenes. The guy promised to give everyone more screen time, but they have to make sure everyone does their job properly or Boss Pei will kill him. The boy had already observed everything and thought that until there is advertising, everything is useless, no matter how popular it is. They saw their boss and immediately turned to him with joy. They exclaimed that Boss Pei had arrived and greeted him. The boy asked if they had come to film the 4th episode. Chu Xiaoche replied that they had, but there was one more matter to discuss. It was about sponsorship. Pei-chan thought about this and paused for a moment. He clearly had an idea. The boy asked the director to discuss it in his office, and he immediately agreed. Chu Xiaoce was already sitting in the chair opposite his boss and told him that they had received their first sponsorship offer the day before yesterday. In other words, they can start making money from these shoots. The boss almost spilled his cup of tea when he heard this. Beads of sweat broke out on his face. Pei-chan was very surprised and thought that it was too fast, since only a few days had passed. Chu Xiaotze explained that this was an advertisement for an online clothing store, and they were hoping to advertise their new t-shirt. They also had to have a supporting character recite the ad's slogan and wear their clothes in the commercial. Pei Qian asked what the price was. Chu Xiaohe replied, 5,000 yuan. It wasn't much, but since this was their first step, he asked his boss what he thought. Pei Qian thought about how he remembered that in 2011, Director X's first sponsorship partnership only cost 1,000 yuan. Compared to investments, it's not that much, but Chu Xiao is right, and this is just the first step. The boy got upset and put the cup of tea down on the table with all his might, so roughly that the tea spilled all over the table. After that, he smiled a little and, looking at his employee, began to offer him something. He exclaimed that he was thinking of rejecting the offer. Chu Xiao hadn't expected such a turn of events. Chu Xiaotze sweated and adjusted his glasses, casting a surprised glance at his boss. He exclaimed that he didn't understand why. He asked his boss for an explanation. The boy replied to his employee that the most important thing in business is foresight. 5,000 yuan for a little hidden advertising certainly sounds good. However, if they add a t-shirt, won't they have to change the theme to make it all look harmonious? Will it create the same impression? And what if they are then offered to advertise cosmetics, shower gel or shampoo? Isn't it a waste of time if the value is diminished by a mere 5,000? Pei Qian remarked that it would ruin his reputation. Chu Xiaotze thought that this was to be expected. The boss thought differently. He was focused on the 5,000, but Boss Pei was focused on the product's value. Pei Qian said that to achieve success, you need to play big, take risks, and build a reputation. You should never let money dictate the process. He asked the boy if he understood. Chu Xiaocha told his boss that he understood perfectly. Pei Qian decided that this was very good and that he could fool him. The boy asked if he could set the standard for sponsorship offers if he listened to him. As he said this, the boy raised his finger up, as if clarifying what he had just proposed. He explained that they only accept high-quality handcrafted work. 100,000 rubles per proposal. To ensure everything is high quality, they must focus on the sponsored product. Then they can be confident in the quality of the audience experience, commercial effectiveness, and reputation. It's a win-win situation all around. Chu Xiaocha told his boss that it was not easy to get the offer, let alone finish the video focused on the sponsored product. Pei Qian took his comrade by the shoulder and, closing his eyes, said that he believed in him and he should believe in himself. But the boy, in turn, became upset and, drawing his eyebrows closer to his nose, answered the boss that he understood him. Chu Xiaotze left the office very upset and went about his business, but he thought that he had barely deceived him and that he would be able to cut Boss Pei's life income by 99%. Pei Qian remained in his office, sitting on the sofa and drinking tea. Someone knocked on his door. The boy closed his eyes, thought about something, and told the unexpected guest to come in. He asked the employee what was wrong. The guy explained that there was a problem with the voiceover. He had already found famous voice actors, and they had tried to record a couple of lines. He doesn't know who to choose, and asks if the boss can listen and choose himself. Pei Qian thought that of course he would listen. The voiceover was supposed to discourage the player from playing. Nerds will love it if they hear Tsundere's voice teasing them all the time. If you choose a kind and gentle, very seductive voice, that won't work either. A normal voice sounds ordinary. It has no character, and that's good. When the boy listened to the next recording, he decided that this voice was quite good. He told Lu Ming Liang where he left off and found it unusual. He thought to himself that just listening to his voice seemed insolent. It would be enough to discourage the players from continuing the game. The employee was about to object, but the boss immediately asked if he was busy or overpaid. Pei Qian recommended simply raising his salary, but the employee told the boss that it was a demo he'd sent to the actors. He was the one recording it. Pei Qian was very surprised and replied that it was not like him at all. Then the guy explained that he was holding his nose and asked if he wanted to choose someone else. Pei Qian replied that he was choosing him and needed his clear and distinct voice. No one could do it better. The guy explained to the boss that they didn't have the equipment. Pei Qian asked if he thought this was a problem. Couldn't he rent a studio? Could he rent it for 3 days and hire a professional to oversee the process? If 3 days weren't enough, he could extend it, and the budget was unlimited. Lu Ming Liang agreed with his boss and said he'd go find Shin's assistant to plan everything out. Pei Qian remained in his office, satisfied. He wondered why there were so many talented people around him. It was February 24th, a development team meeting. Lu Ming Liang said there were 2 things to discuss today. The first is that he informs them that he will be gone for a few days because he will be doing voiceover work for a game developer. During the development process, the lead planner needed to provide voiceover. Mayan asked the guys not to even ask about it because he himself was shocked. Secondly, he hopes that everyone is diligent in what they do. If there are any problems, they should come and discuss them. The honey mushrooms continued to sit at the table, each doing their own thing and discussing their next steps. Yama wondered why Lin Wan was reading the plan so seriously. Wasn't that what he should be doing? As the girl carefully examined the plan of action, she said that she thought she understood Boss Pei. The guy asked if she meant that he was doing the voiceover. The girl replied that it was exactly that. She could see that the intention was buried so deeply that none of them even noticed. It reminded her of Pei's boss's life. The game developer is also expressive thanks to his dark humor. An additional erosion effect. The girl asked to look at the lines that Boss Pei personally suggested. The narrative will keep players tangled from start to finish. Every decision will seem like the best and most beneficial. But what happens in the end? If you follow the voice's advice, your reputation will be destroyed. Players will curse you, and you will earn nothing. And the narrator will continue to laugh at you, at the boss's inability to make decisions and his gullibility. They were simply following instructions. They failed not because of the narrator, but because they couldn't distinguish good from bad. Ma Yan exclaimed that now he understood, and the narrator must intensify the feeling of defeat. He must make it paradoxical. Another employee raised her hand and asked why it was possible to fail, even without following his advice. Or was that some kind of irony, too? Lin Wan crossed her arms over her chest and, looking at the girl, replied that she thought this was the highlight of the game. Knowing that it wasn't the key to success, in one of the endings, it turns out the developer was too kind. As a result, players were completely unwilling to spend money on his games. The games had decent ratings, but they didn't break even, so he had to leave the market. This shows that even desire and zeal don't guarantee success. She knows it's cruel, but it's the truth of the gaming industry. It is difficult to earn both reputation and money, and their success thanks to the leadership of Boss Pei. The employee agreed with the girl and said he now understood that Pei, the boss, had carefully changed everything in the game. From the concept to the plan, and even the script. They only addressed superficial issues. Boss Pei Qian was dealing with enormous pressure. Lin Wan exclaimed that now it was clear why Boss Pei chose him to voice him. He can do voiceovers, and his main advantage is that he understands the game. A narrator must reflect the developer's inner greed and envy, tempt the developer to take the wrong path from the very beginning. Eventually, they'll have to learn all the tricks of the game industry. A typical voice actor wouldn't understand that. The guy thought that it was no wonder that Boss Pei personally changed the lines and assigned him to voice it. So that's how it was. Now he understood everything perfectly. Luming Liang said that he wouldn't disappoint Boss Pei. And here before us are the beautiful, tall, multi-story buildings that brought joy to people's lives on March 3rd. Pei Qian was in his office, his eyes closed, thinking about something. He heard that Father Bao had returned to take care of him. He was told that he had also lost weight and his posture had improved. Pei Qian was seriously surprised that Bao Shu returned from vacation because he did not expect this. Mayan told the boy that his complexion had improved and his hair had been restored. He explained to Brother Bao that he'd sent him all the development documents for the new game. She asked if he'd take a look at what needed to be changed. Bao Shu replied that he didn't think it was worth it, since Boss Pei was the one who decided. Besides, he wouldn't understand. Pei Qian had planned it that way. Development had begun, and even after Bai Shu's return, he couldn't interfere. The boy smiled, satisfied that this way the game would not be successful. He smiled slyly and decided to himself that his plan had succeeded. Meanwhile, Bai Shu approached the counter and began choosing packs of cookies. Then he walked up to the water counter and chose a bottle of Coca-Cola. The boy got himself a lot of different crisps and sweet water and went to his workplace. He opened the package of cookies and also began to open a glass of water so that he could spend the working day in peace. He walked over to his desk and reached for his headphones. He turned on the music and smiled happily. Bai Shu thought about how he hadn't played for a month, and this company was pure heaven. This is what happiness is. He hasn't played for a month, but there's a feeling that something is wrong with the sensitivity. It was as if everything was happening differently in the game, and he couldn't understand what was going on. Since there was nothing else to do, he could optimize the Ocean Fortress a little, and he reached for the book. The boy decided that the Ghost General also needed to be optimized. Bai Shu thought that he even noticed a couple of mistakes, and he was simply great. After he'd spent some time working on this, he realized he'd have to fix them in 3 or 4 days. He decided it would be a piece of cake, and now 3 days have passed. The day was bright and sunny, the sky quite blue. The guy asked if there would ever be a new version of the Ghost General. The employee replied that he'd already completed everything and would soon complete his collection of rare cards. And on the trolley bus, someone was telling another that he envied those who play Three Kingdoms and have updates every 2 months. The guy replied that he would indeed soon get tired of it and didn't even expect anything new to appear in the game. Maybe they'll add new characters or something so they can pay. Meanwhile, the boy continued listening to the music with his eyes closed and tapping away at the keys. He began reading that they'd never seen such a lazy group of developers. Wasn't it obvious that the Phantom General could make a huge amount of money, given that the count had always been at the top of the ratings? But why not release a new version? Then what are they thinking, and why aren't they adding new products for purchase? Don't they really care about money? They can't really avoid making a profit. What he saw today was a bug in Guan Yu's combo attack, which was very low damage, which caused dissatisfaction among players, and it was fixed. The attack has been fixed and is now playable, and the issue with activating Zhao Yun's passive ability has been resolved. He fixed a lot of bugs. Meanwhile, one of the guys was saying that other companies first add temporary improvements and events and then fix bugs. But Tengda did the opposite. The second one replied that then they could hope for a new version. Tengda hadn't abandoned the ghostly general, and they were very touched. They were all so sincere. The guy started hitting the keys with his hands. People begged for a favor and talked about having money. It was March 7th. Someone was hurrying towards their boss's door faster and faster. When the girl approached the boss, Pei Qian said that the Ghost General's players had crashed the hotline, and the forum was full of requests for new content. Lin Wan replied that everything was correct, and judging by the response from players, it was in high demand. The boss asked the girl if she was sure she'd understood everything correctly. Were they really asking for new content? The boy's blood pressure suddenly rose. Lin Wan replied that in addition to the hotline, players also discussed this on the forum. Pei Qian asked if there were any details and why players were demanding new content. What was the point of it all? The girl explained that it seems the players are certain that the Ghost General is going to be shut down, so they want to support them financially. The boy didn't expect this outcome. He turned away, deep in thought. Lin Wan asked the boss what was wrong and said that he looked sick. Pei Qian told the girl that everything was fine. He asked her to tell the customer service department to respond that a new version was in development. The boy thought for a moment and said that it would be ready sometime in May or June. The girl became very angry and asked why she didn't know anything about this. But what else could she do? She simply agreed with the boss and walked towards the door. Pei Qian decided that this was simply unbelievable and leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. From a lonely desert road to a ghostly general and an ocean fortress, they all became very popular. The boy decided he couldn't take it anymore. He just couldn't. Why, when he started developing the system, did it have rules that no one should know or suspect its existence? If the situation with the Ghost General escalates, he'll definitely attract attention. He risks breaking the rules. Pei Qian decided to wait for the game developer to come out first. Then they'd release an update for the Phantom General and set a rock-bottom price to trick them. He decided to take a look at the internet cafe's plans. He couldn't allow anything to happen there. Pei Qian rushed to his door and exited. And now, he found himself next to a large supermarket. Above the door hung a logo in the form of a fish looking to the side. The boy thought about the large logo at the entrance. Not a word in English or Chinese. It must have been Ma Yan. He decided it was good. It created the impression that, although he didn't understand what it was beautiful. People won't understand what kind of place this is, and it's just great work on his part. It looked pretty good. There were several people in front of him doing their jobs. There was a woman behind the counter who was wiping the counter with a rag and humming something. Ma Yan met his boss and asked him if he was satisfied with what he had done. He wanted anything else and asked to see how they'd arranged the bar. How did he like the new arrangement of tables and chairs? He asked his boss what books to put on this shelf. And the boy approached the bookshelf. He said he thought they should put up a couple of physical copies of online novels, manhwa, and figurines. And maybe they'd put up some Russian classics, or something like that. Pei Qian suddenly coughed and told Old Man Ma that he meant that there shouldn't be books here. Then the guy asked his boss what he meant. The boy replied that manhwa and novellas were too vulgar. He asked him to display the most luxurious books. Ma Yan asked his boss to tell him a couple of names to make purchasing easier. Pei Qian instructed him to listen carefully. He talked about a brief history of Ukrainian tractors and a training manual for driving small tractors and all that sort of thing. The story of the tractor station manager and chief economist. The use and maintenance of tractors. Yan Ma couldn't understand why they were all talking about tractors. Pei Qian explained that the more ordinary, the more elegant. He understands this. He needs to go online and search for cultured youth bookshelves. Pick a couple of books with meaningless titles and buy them. Ma Yan told his boss that he would do just that. He put his hands on his head and asked the boy to come with him to look at the kitchen. He explained that they hadn't found a boss yet, but asked him not to worry. They'd already received a couple of applications for the position. Tycoon replied that he'd already told him what kind of chef he wanted. He wanted him to specialize in home-cooked food. Ma Yan asked him to give it to him. The boss immediately agreed and said that he would have had so many problems if it weren't for him. Then the boy asked his brother Tycoon not to praise him, so that he would not become arrogant. The boss asked Ma Yan not to worry, but to confess as much as he could, since being modest was not his style. When the boy brought his boss to the computer, he offered him to try one of them. Tycoon sat down in the chair and thought it was very comfortable, as expected from chairs that cost a fortune. The boy asked to tell the waiters that when a customer sits down at the computer, they should bring a clean towel to dry their hands, like in expensive restaurants. Ma Yan put his hand to his head and asked the boss if it wasn't too much. Tycoon asked him what he thought of the place. It was a high-end entertainment center. All their clients are from wealthy families. They need to be provided with the appropriate service. Does he understand that? Moreover, the entire establishment must be smoke-free. Such a beautiful place can't be allowed to be polluted by smoke. Ventilation needed to be installed to improve air circulation. Ma Yan agreed with his boss. Suddenly a young man approached him, holding a tray with a cocktail. He brought this cocktail to the boss and asked him to try it. Tycoon reached out and picked up the long-stemmed glass. He closed his eyes and began to sample the cocktail. The young man asked what the drink was and how much it cost. The employee told his boss it was Aurora jungle juice. A cocktail like that costs 50 yen. There's grappa there, 400 won for 700 milliliters. A serving requires 30 milliliters. Tycoon asked how much the cheapest cocktail cost. The guy replied 25 yuan. Most bars have this pricing policy, and of course they can lower the price. The boss asked his friend to add another 10 yen to the price of each cocktail. Customers are receiving top-notch service. If the price is too low, it will feel like they're looking down on them. The guy didn't expect that turn of events. Tycoon couldn't figure out what to do. If the prices were too low and people came here just to drink, wouldn't that increase profits? Currently, 2 hours of play and a cocktail cost 80 yen. That's enough to play at any internet cafe all night. Tycoon said he was happy with everything. He explained to the boys that he had some business to attend to and said he was leaving. Ma Yan told the boss they've decided to open the day after tomorrow. What does he think he should do for the opening? He's thinking of offering a 50% discount on computers and alcohol for the first 3 days. Tycoon replied that this was too modest. They were a high-class internet cafe after all. He asked them not to make a big deal about the opening. Ma Yan scratched his head and said he understood. Then there would be no organizing. The boy, in turn, was very happy with this outcome. He thought that he would return when the cafe opened. He'll be very happy when he sees how empty this internet cafe will be. March 9th arrived. The internet cafe officially opened on this day. At first it was empty. Not a single person had yet visited the cafe. The boy was wiping his cup with a towel, thinking about something. He was very sad and dejected. You could say he simply had no face. The staff were cleaning and keeping the internet cafe clean, and the boy almost fell asleep. Tycoon brought the cup of coffee to his lips and began to drink it with a smile. He closed his eyes and, smiling, exclaimed that it was simply delicious. Yanma looked at him strangely. He told his boss that they could send a couple of employees out to hand out leaflets to people. But Tycoon asked why and said that it would look cheap. They need to be found without advertising, and that's the only way they'll surprise them. Ma Yan was even more surprised and asked how that would happen, and how anyone would find them without advertising. The boy was very upset and couldn't understand why their boss was acting like this. Meanwhile, a boy was passing by the cafe and decided to stop by. Ma Yan greeted him politely, a smile on his face, and asked if he wanted to surf the internet or have a coffee. Then the guy looked at him in response and asked how much an hour of use cost. Ma Yan raised his finger and replied with a smile, 10 yuan per hour. Then the guy who came into the internet cafe asked if they really had golden coffee or golden computers. Ma Yan asked him where he saw gold. All the computers were top of the line. Even he thought it was a bit pricey. Then the guy got really tense and asked if there were any membership bonuses. Ma Yan reached for the menu and told the boy that there were bonuses. Once he gets a membership, he will get 10% discount on drinks. The customer began to peer at the menu and thought about something. He was shocked by the numbers. The guy bowed and apologized, saying that he was from a poor family. He said goodbye and vanished without a trace. The client simply ran out of their internet cafe. Ma Yan was extremely upset. He was left holding the menu in his hands and with tears in his eyes. Meanwhile, the boss finished his coffee and happily watched the employee. He told old Ma he was a genius. He called his work excellent. But the guy told the boss he didn't think it would work. Only a couple of people inquired the entire evening, and everyone left as soon as they heard the price. The boss said that this was indeed the case. It shouldn't go on like this. Ma Yan was delighted and thought that the boss finally understood that he needed to organize events and advertising, but Pei Qian asked him to make a sign. Post the price tag at the entrance, and that would save them the time they spent on announcing the price. This is all a waste of time. The guy became even more angry when he heard this proposal. Pei Qian said that if they complained, it would be better for him not to come in at all. It would save them and their time. Ma Yan became upset and exclaimed to himself that this simply could not continue. The boss asked the boy not to worry so much, because it was only the first day. He asked him to keep this in mind. This is the long-term plan of the Tengda Corporation. Even huge losses over 3 or 6 months are normal. But here it's just one day. Everything will be fine. Does he understand that? Pei Qian said he needed to get to work, and after saying goodbye, headed for the door. The boy thought to himself that the coffee was very tasty and left the establishment with a happy face. Meanwhile, a bright and beautiful night had fallen. It was Sunday, March 14th. The guy wrote down that the rent was $315,000 per month. Expenses on materials, bills, and salaries totaled over $70,000 per month. Even if they did nothing for a whole month, the losses would be around $400,000. Moreover, the first investment in the internet cafe was $2 million. If you calculate sales over 3 days, you'll find they're earning less than a small coffee shop of a few square meters. And given the current situation, that's a complete disaster. His friend asked him not to discuss the break-even point. He's afraid they'll be losing at least $300,000 a month. He told Brother Ma that he was close to boss Pei and could talk to him. This couldn't go on, and they needed to come up with a plan. The boy replied that the boss had told him to be patient. They would discuss everything in a week. Then the comrade replied that in a week, it would be the 21st. Why don't they just watch for now? Ma Yan said that we should listen to Boss Pei and talk in a week. His friend agreed, and they sat in an internet cafe waiting for customers. The guy wondered how many months he would receive his 10,000 salary. Meanwhile, in front of us there was a huge, luxurious building that towered towards the sky. Huang Xibo stood opposite him, saying that he never thought he would return here. He said on the phone that he had arrived and asked what he was. Huang Xibo replied that he would wait for him at the usual place, and so the guy opened the door with his hand when he had already approached the appointed place. Huang Xibo waved to the boy and said he was already here. There was a cup of coffee on the table. This guy's name was Ma Dubiano, nicknamed Ma Yi Kun. He was the company's planner. The guy asked if Juan had a tan. The guy replied that it was probably because he worked outside that he got a tan. He forgot to tell him. He no longer works in the gaming industry and is now filming his own TV series. Huang Xibo asked if he'd seen Boss Pei's life. He explained to the boy that he'd filmed it. Yikyun was very surprised and exclaimed that he was so popular now. He asked what he was doing now. Screenwriter, director, a producer. Huang Xibo replied with a business-like air that it was difficult to say exactly what he did. He worked here and there and was considered a partner. Yikyun said that this was very cool and that he had finally found a suitable job. The boy congratulated his friend. Huang Xibo asked him how the company was doing. Yikyun replied to his comrade that everything was as usual. Lifeless, like stagnant water. Old man Liu seemed to have lost his mind. He was determined that the sword in the new version would cost 888 yuan. It would be one thing if he wanted to sell a unique item for that amount, but there are hundreds of them, and he still wants that much money. Isn't that crazy? Then they realized he was jealous of the ocean fortress. He figured that if a red dragon was selling for 888 yuan there, they'd have a sword too. As expected, when the game was released, the players cursed them. After that, Boss Liu became merciless. Everyone at their desks heard the screams coming from the conference room. Huang Xibo replied that the reason the Ocean Fortress sold the Red Dragon for that price was because it was the only item in the store. The quality of the Ocean Fortress is excellent, and based on store prices, it should cost at least 50 yuan. But the Ocean Fortress is free, and they only sell the Red Dragon, and that's all a concession. Huang Xibo mentioned that the Red Dragon's stats aren't that high compared to other weapons. Plus, it doesn't provide any bonuses. The weapon is permanently purchased, looks cool, and can be used anywhere. Of course people will buy it. And Kun told Brother Huang that he left the gaming industry, but how did he still know so much about games? The boy looked down and replied that in fact the ocean fortress was designed by him and he was the main planner. When Yikun heard this version, he immediately spilled the coffee that was in his cup. Huang Xibo explained to his friend that he hadn't told him this because he himself was in shock and didn't know where to start. He understands that the boy is surprised by what he just heard. Well, it's really true. Before he could finish this sentence, Yikun reached out his hand and took his hands. He asked his friend to recommend him there. He promised to quit the next day. And so March 16th arrived. The employees were sitting at their work computers. The boy held Ma Dubiano's file in his hands and examined it carefully. Yixuan replied to Boss Pei that everything was correct, and he could call him Yi-kun. That's what everyone called him. Pei-kin thought for a moment and decided that, judging by his resume, there was nothing remarkable about him. He was Huang Xibo's comrade in misfortune. Since Huang Xibo's position is still vacant, it would be a good idea to hire a new employee. The boy explained to the boss that there were his stories, essays, novels that he wrote, and asked him to take a look. Pei-kin immediately extended his hand towards his resume and took his notes with a smile. He thought it was close and that he was a very good writer. The flow of sentences was smooth and refined. He seemed to be able to write classical Chinese. Still, he couldn't get it. Pei-kin told Yi-kun that he'd joined his company in October. He asked what the young man had been doing before and decided he'd find a reason to turn him down. Yi-kun replied that he'd been writing web novels since graduating from university. Although he hadn't advertised them, he'd gained a lot of readers thanks to word of mouth among gamers. After assessing the statistics, he decided to make the chapters pairs for, but only 30 people purchased them. Pei-chen was surprised that the published book might not be the best. He asked about writing a new one. Yi-chun replied that he'd written not one, but 3. They all had good reviews, but once he made them paid, the number of purchases never exceeded 100. He'd written about 1 million words, and all for nothing. Huang Xibo asked if he had completely lost his fear and what he had written that made everyone against him. The guy replied that he didn't know, and would like to know too. Suddenly the boss exclaimed that this was just great, and he was hired. Pei-kin was glad that his publications did not sell. The employees sat at their desks near the computer. Lu Mingliang clicked on the keyboard, searching for some information. He glanced at the monitor and was very surprised. He was surprised that the boy had done it so quickly. They thanked the boss for the incredible speed. The guy replied that it was thanks to Boss Pei's development. He had inspired him. The participant wrote that he is not very close to games, but it seems that the game is full of irony about the gaming industry and a lot of dark humor. It seems like the player is being mocked, but in reality, he's being immersed in the developers' feelings within the industry and reflecting the chaos in their circles. Pei-kin approached the boy. He immediately turned his head towards his boss. He immediately jumped up from his chair and asked if he had any instructions. But the boss stopped the boy and explained that he simply wanted to say that they had a new screenwriter. Lu Mingliang replied that he understood. He would immediately order him to redo the synopsis for all 3 games. But the boy replied to his friend that this was not what he meant at all. He means that this employee is new and is not familiar with games at all. Lu Mingliang exclaimed that he would simply do nothing. Did he understand correctly? Pei-kin told his employee that this was indeed the case. He especially shouldn't be given anything related to the game developer. He thought that Yi-kun was a good writer, and if he changed something, the game could become popular. Lu Mingliang listened to his boss and said he understood everything. He would teach him something. The story and narrative in the game developer is the job of Boss Pei-chen. The boy started heading towards the door and suddenly noticed the concept art. In front of him on the screen was a huge, powerful wolf, with fangs and claws, as terrible as if he were a werewolf. He found it very strange that these pictures seemed very familiar to him. When Lu Mingliang approached the computer, he asked the boss if he had noticed. The boy exclaimed that it was indeed so, and that these were the works of Ruan Guangjian. Could they really be connected, and that he recognized him with just one glance? Pei-kin got angry and asked if he hadn't asked him to find the most expensive artist. Lu Mingliang told his boss that, of course, he had asked. Ruan was now the most expensive artist. The boy didn't expect such a turn of events. Ruan Guangjian went from being a newbie to a highly paid artist in just a couple of months. How he outpaced housing prices. Lu Mingliang said that even when he heard that it was his project, he took less from them and he was very kind. Pei-kin asked if they could change the terms of the contract any further. Then the boy asked if he wanted to pay him more, but he's afraid it will be difficult to arrange and Boss Ruan won't agree to it. Pei-kin then asked the employee to continue working and headed towards the door. He found himself in his office and immediately sat down on the sofa. The boy couldn't understand how this had happened. Not only was he unable to spend the money, but the drawings would also be from Ruan Guangjian. a master pretending to be a novice. Tycoon grabbed his head with his hands and thought that if he couldn't change the terms of the contract, then he should wait for the result first. Thank goodness a game developer isn't completely dependent on graphics. Suddenly someone knocked on the door. The boy couldn't understand what Ma Yan was doing there. Had something really happened in the internet cafe? I hoped it was nothing bad. An employee burst into the office and told the boss that he thought the situation in the cafe needed to be changed. Tycoon immediately asked the boy to come in. Young Ma sat down in a chair and began to explain that Zhang Yuan had calculated everything. According to his calculations, the internet cafe will lose about 300,000 in profits every month, which is barely enough to cover employees' salaries and bills. The most expensive thing is rent, and they can't cover it in any way. Zhang Yuan has a proposal, and he feels it needs to be thought about. The boy approached his boss and asked him to look at the proposal. But the boss replied that he'd already told him not to worry. It meant their internet cafe was moving in the right direction. He thought that over 300,000 in a month was simply incredible, and he hadn't expected anything worse. But Ma Yan grabbed his head with his hands and exclaimed that they were losing 300,000, and he said that they were moving in the right direction. Tycoon said that the very existence of internet cafes is a high-quality form of marketing. Temporary losses aren't a problem, because they're buying reputation with that money. Once they gain a reputation, will he still be thinking about the lack of visitors? That's why everything is fine now. The boss gave the order to be patient and wait. He smiled at his comrade and asked him to trust him. The boss thought that Boss Pei's life and the game developer were also showing signs of failure. If something happened to the internet cafe, his heart wouldn't be able to take it. It's March 25th. The game developer's development has been successfully completed, and the game is in the optimization phase. The boy sat at his computer and took off his headphones. He caught his breath. Was Lu Mingliang's voice acting good? He wondered how he managed to create such a disgusting voice. The boys thought the game was so boring and uninteresting. Even the narrative mocked them, and they wanted to punch Lu Mingliang to vent their anger. There's nothing else to do here except walk back and forth, open doors, and listen to that voice. Tycoon sat watching everything that was happening and thought that the game had obviously been a success this time. There's nothing else to change here, and all that remains is to sit and wait for losses. Lu Mingliang asked his brother Bao Shu how he was doing, and whether he needed to change anything else in the game. Yichen also asked how they were enjoying it. Most people thought the game was indeed a bit boring. The guy explained that the game was personally developed by the boss, Pei Qian, but he didn't want to continue playing it. No one except Lin Wan had the confidence to play it. Yichen asked the guys why he thought this game was really special. The guy extended his hand forward and expressed his opinion in this way. Baishu said he thought they thought that way because they were the ones who created it and couldn't make a rational assessment. Lu Mingliang asked what he meant by reasonable assessment. Baishu began to explain that they knew the game's plots and all the solutions. So if they knew what the next step was, they'd take everything more easily. And as an observer, he was very interested in everything. He was a new employee, so he must be of the same opinion. And Kyun replied that he indeed thought so too and had never seen such games. It doesn't fit into any existing category. If this were Shangyang game, they would definitely have abandoned the idea. There are no similar games, so it's a risk. They definitely wouldn't invest in something like that. The boy thought about how Tengda was quietly saving up her money. The boss will take responsibility for implementing the new idea, and the employees will unite. Baishu exclaimed that this did not mean the game could make a profit. This seems like a smart move by Pei's boss. He could become famous, or he could lose everything, and it all depends on the reviews. The boy said sadly, looking ahead, that it seemed to him as if Boss Pei had always been alone. Lu Mingliang asked if he thought the boss was always lonely. He thought he was positive and friendly, but Bai Shu asked if he remembered what he was like at the meeting. The boy immediately became thoughtful. He said that when they celebrated the success of the Ocean Fortress, what was it like? He sat silently and didn't attack the food. He was thinking too much, as if he was pondering something. Baishu said that when the development of Ocean Fortress had just finished, the game was gaining popularity. In front of everyone was a menu of delicacies. Was there any reason for losing one's appetite? But then, why was Boss Pei so depressed? The only reason was the loneliness in his soul. He suggested recalling the Ghost General, why he cost 10 yuan, while the VIP cost 30 yuan. He thinks it's a jab at the gaming industry. Deep down, he believed that such a game wasn't worth that much. How could a single card cost hundreds and thousands of yuan? A lonely, deserted road, then a ghostly general, an ocean fortress, and now a game developer. a driving simulator that will help them reflect on life. The boy continued to say that Boss Pei used unique ways to mock the gaming industry. Luming Lang said that if the game had such a deep meaning, then why did he, Brother Bao, think that the game would either succeed or fail? Yichen asked if this wasn't the case with everyone who was one step ahead of their time. It was hard for ordinary people to understand true creators. It won't be a defeat for Pei's boss if the game developer fails, because today's players don't deserve such a game. Baishu said that perhaps they would gradually understand its meaning, but right now he wasn't sure. The boys continued to listen to their friend, not understanding what was really going on. Then the boy asked his employees how they would advertise the game. Luming Liang thought for a moment and replied that they hadn't asked yet, and he would go and ask the boss now. Luming Liang was very excited and wondered what kind of advertising method Boss Pei would choose this time. He was also curious about what his boss was thinking and looked at him as if expecting a verdict. He imagined a gavel in front of him and the actual passing of a sentence. The boy asked how they would advertise this time and who wanted to speak first. But will they seriously advertise it? And what if the game becomes popular? No, you have to look at it from a development perspective and nothing else. Thanks to the Ghost General and the Ocean Fortress, Tengda has a reputation. Even if they don't advertise anything, players will already be interested. Then it's better to advertise, and they'll spend a lot more money that way. It's a fantastic idea. Traditional methods like buying ad space and finding people to advertise with are unacceptable. Advertising is bound to be expensive and ineffective. This means that they will ask the authors of the videos to advertise their game. Luming Liang was upset again and thought about how video marketing was the cheapest and most ineffective form of advertising. Why had Boss Pei chosen it? He asked if he meant they should contact Huang Sibo and ask him to film a promotional special, using the popularity of Pei's boss's life to promote the game developer. Peikin replied that of course not. Boss Pei's life was currently in the reputation-building phase. They couldn't allow the game's promotion to damage their reputation just because it was a short series. The boy thought that Fei Huan's office belonged entirely to Tengda. If you invest money there, it will be the same as transferring it from one hand to another. Luming Lang asked if in this case it would be possible to contact a famous blogger who had many fans. Then the boss told his employee to do just that. Tomorrow he'll give him a list of names, materials, and text, and he'll do everything exactly as he says. Luming Liang immediately rejoiced and agreed with his boss. Enormous high-rise buildings rose up to the sky and were still illuminated by the evening sun. The boy was sitting at the table, eating pasta and thinking about something. He thought about how his business was failing. He couldn't even afford noodles. He was jealous because he had so many views. They could get sponsorship. The guy continued to watch, looking at the monitor screen, and some thoughts arose in his head. They greeted Teacher Chow and told him he was Tengda's chief planner, Luming Liang, and that he would like to discuss cooperation. The boy asked if he was free. Teacher Chow wrote that of course he was free. This all happened just in time, as he was dying of hunger. The teacher immediately got ready and instantly found himself at the door of this company. Luming Liang promised to earn 3,000 wen per video. He asked what the teacher would say. Chow was simply shocked by the sum and the company's wealth. It would be enough for him to do nothing for 2 weeks. The guy agreed and asked Luming Liang what kind of video it was. The boy explained that these were video comments. They demanded that he strictly adhere to the video's plan. You can't deviate from the script under any circumstances. These are their terms, and he handed the paper to the teacher. The man started looking at it and was very surprised. Could it be slower? It was amazing. There were smacking and swallowing sounds. It was simply incredible. What a great opening scene. And it's worth 3 yen alone. He'll try to run through it and not praise the game too much, so as not to flatter her. Are they really joking and wanting him to read this video? Luming Liang explained to the teacher that they would like his face to be visible. It was okay without it, and he would send him the notes and materials later. Xiao thought they wanted him to be in the video and wanted to destroy his reputation. He thought they wanted to let him take advantage of them, but they wanted to ruin his career. The teacher exclaimed that he couldn't accept this and that they'd better find someone else. Even though he was penniless, he still had some self-respect. When the teacher wanted to leave, Luming Liang offered to increase the amount to 4,000. At this point, the man paused for a moment and thought. He turned his head toward the boy. He adds as much as he was usually offered in total when he worked as a teacher. The man raised his hand and asked if he could play the game. Luming Liang apologized and said that the game was in the testing phase and they could not release it, but they can provide him with video footage. That will be enough for editing. The teacher thought about the video materials and the script. He had everything prepared. All he had to do was hold his nose and read the script, and then add the video games. Once he published it, he'd get 4,000 yen. But when he publishes it, he will be criticized not for doing a lousy job for money, but for doing a bad job for money. Teacher Cow asked if he could upload this video to the horror games column. He thought to himself that as long as he kept publishing videos in this column, people would think it was ironic and interest would increase. Luming Liang replied that it was impossible, but the teacher said he understood his concerns but urged him not to worry. The popularity of the terrible games column is 10 times higher than the new games of the month column. He once developed a game called Lonely Desert Road, a driving simulator that would help people reflect on life. As a result, the game became an instant hit, with sales reaching 200,000 in 2 weeks. The teacher asked if that was the name of the company and decided to look it up on the internet. When he started Googling, the man had a bad feeling. He asked again what their sponsor was. The boy smiled in response. He sighed and replied to the man that it seemed like he and Boss Pei had already worked together, and that was very good. The teacher exclaimed that it was from their companies, and he had no idea that he had already worked with this company. He thought to himself that it was surprising, because the Tengda also created a ghost general and an ocean fortress. Luming Liang spread his arms and asked the man to wait. He explained that he would ask Boss Pei's opinion. Tao decided who this small company is that decided to make a small game a couple of months ago and is now sponsoring it. And it's simply amazing. It looks like this is the leader of Tengda. Just don't tell him he created a lonely, deserted road. Doesn't he hold a grudge against him? It's the end of the world for him now. His career will most likely end there. Luming Liang returned to his comrade and explained that Boss Pei was happy. But he said that the videos must be published in the new games of the month column and the scripts cannot be changed. Moreover, he can't let the audience think it's ironic. They must sound natural. The man decided that Pei's boss was definitely angry with him. He wanted him to look like an idiot. The teacher apologized and said the demands were too high and he couldn't meet them. It would be better to find someone else. But before he could take his leave, Luming Liang raised his salary to 6,000 yen. He explained that he had just consulted with Pei's boss. He said they could raise the price to 6,000. Then the teacher grabbed his head and thought that they were making fun of him. And it was not about money at all. But if you spend these 6,000 wisely, you cannot work for 2 months. He exclaimed that it wasn't about the money. But the boy told the teacher that he'd consulted with his boss again, and the boy had told him to raise the price to 10,000. Then the man was simply shocked by such a proposal, and his eyes lit up. Various bills flashed in front of him, namely a whole wad of 10 yen. He didn't know what to do. He imagined this money and wondered what to do. Luming Liang explained that they knew he was a blogger who valued his reputation. They weren't forcing him to accept their offer, so he could refuse. But the man again began to explain to the boy that it wasn't about money. Boss Pei was his old friend and he would help him. Luming Liang asked if he was telling the truth and exclaimed that it was simply excellent. When would he send him the materials? Tao thought it was for the sake of survival and nothing to be ashamed of. He was confident the audience would understand and decided to agree. Meanwhile, the employee sat at the table staring at the computer monitor. In front of us is the president's office, and an employee knocked on the wooden door. Peiken sat at his desk in his luxurious plush chair, waiting for the employee. He asked Luming Liang if the teacher agreed, and exclaimed that it was just great. The boy thought he shouldn't have messed with him. If it weren't for him, he would have lost 50,000, and everything would have been completely different. Then the boss asked his employee what happened to the rest of the people on their list. Luming Liang replied that even after the price increase, some refused. But most agreed, and about half did too. At first, most refused, but when they learned that others would also be making similar videos and that the videos could be deleted after a month, they agreed, and they also increased their salaries. Peiken decided that no matter how shameful the script was, people would read it as long as they were paid enough. And that was not surprising. The boy said they paid Teacher Chow the most. Let him post the video first, and the employee immediately agreed. Meanwhile, April 1st arrived, and that day was April Fool's Day. Teacher Cow sat in the room at his computer, frantically thinking about something. He thought about how today was April Fool's Day, and that Boss Pei had probably thought of this. Both the game and the video are coming out today. If you upload a video on April Fool's Day, many will think it's just a joke. Then the curse will be lifted. The teacher struggled with himself and his emotions, and in the end, he exclaimed that he didn't care. He held the system media in front of him, and being very angry, did not stop fighting with himself. The boy threw his phone on the table and took a deep breath. He thought about how he'd gotten the money and done the work. Now he just had to pretend to be dead, and in 2 months everything would go back to normal. Meanwhile, correspondence was ongoing online. Teacher Cao said he welcomed everyone, and that the same in-game godfather was with them. He hoped the audience would give him a chance to catch his breath before the video began. He started slurping and clapping and sighing. He asked if they could see the developer of today's game and explained that it was Tengda. It's a new game developed by this company, and he'll now present a gameplay video. He apologizes, but he's shaking. He hasn't felt this way in a long time, and he's eagerly awaiting the game's release. The development team sent him the footage at 3 in the morning. The game is called Game Developer, and it's simply incredible. The online correspondence continued. The teacher was asked to blink several times if he was being held hostage. Someone wrote that it was clearly an April Fool's joke, since today was April Fool's Day. A ton of questions on the screen. After watching the video, the guy was sure he shouldn't play. But when he learned it was Tengda's creation, he really wants to play and what to do. Another guy decided that you shouldn't try something if you know it's going to suck. You need to value yourself. Another player said it was different for him. He wondered what game had led to his embarrassment. Another blogger posted a video about a game developer. The guy watched it with his mouth open. Another kid with headphones on exclaimed that the script was the same. It even had the slosh slosh and the pop pop. The red-haired guy was simply shocked and asked how many times he had already watched it. What the hell is going on? And so the next day dawned, and Shanhua was before us. Peichen sat in his office in a comfortable chair behind a long wooden table. The boy looked at the computer monitor and smiled, and he exclaimed that his goal had been achieved. Viewers don't care about the commercials. He spent a ton of money on them. Views are few and far between, and his popularity is practically non-existent. The boss remarked that limiting one's opinion was simply an excellent choice. He sipped his coffee with a smile and closed his eyes, rejoicing at his success. The boy thought his plan was half successful. 28 yuan was the lowest price allowed by the system. Based on calculations, the actual investment in the game is around 3 million. If he sets the price at 28 yuan, it will pay for itself in 300,000 purchases. The reputation is already damaged. Maybe there will be some masochists who will play it, but not 390,000. And now, night had fallen outside. The lights were out in the apartments, and cars were racing through the city streets. Teacher Chow was at home, lying on his soft sofa. He took out his phone and began looking at it. He didn't let go of the phone, and thin streams of sweat ran down the boy's face. The teacher said that dirty money isn't so easy to come by. The game isn't so fun anymore, and the noodles seemed tastier. Chow clenched his fist and exclaimed that this couldn't be done. He had to sort out the situation at any cost. The boy was serious and got up from his sofa and headed to the computer. When he turned on the computer, he realized that his reputation could suffer, but he needed to sort everything out. It was a story about game development. When a boy entered the game, he couldn't figure out where he was. The game revealed that he was an aspiring game developer determined to save the domestic gaming industry. The teacher decided he would definitely create the best game. His job is simple: conceive and create a game, wow users, make colleagues jealous, please the media, and explode into the market. Generate revenue and continue developing more games and so on, repeating the cycle. The teacher exclaimed that he loved it and that it was the best game of the year. The audience cheered for Teacher Cao. The game offered to wipe away his drool, as this was all in the distant future. For now, he has one goal: to create a successful game in this cutthroat market. When the guy entered the game, he thought that it was very strange, and it seemed to be not bad. Cao was even more surprised when he realized that the graphics in this game were top-notch. Moreover, he thinks the game's appeal is that it truly reflects the daily life of a game developer. Voiceovers agreed, or maybe they're just those people who only talk and do nothing. Some people get tired of the routine of life. They do the same things every day. It's very sad and disheartening. Some people push forward, continuing to believe in their success. Someone gives up their dream and becomes the very thing they hated most. The teacher seemed to have realized something. He exclaimed that he wasn't Pei's boss. How could someone who could create such a game be so petty? We need to make another video and create a new playlist. Xiao has already started thinking about what to call it. Meanwhile, a new day had dawned, April 3rd. Employees were sitting at their work computers. Bao Shu, Lu Mingliang, and Lin Wan sat around a small table, each holding notes in their hands and studying them carefully. The girl said that, based on statistics, advertising not only had no positive impact, but also reduced a user's desire to play the game developer within 3 days of the release. The first group of players also didn't leave positive reviews. The situation is twofold. Lu Mingliang turned to Brother Bao. He reflected on how this was the first project he had worked on since being promoted to Huang's position. The boy asked what he should do in such a situation and looked at his friend. Brother Bao also peered at his notes, beads of sweat running down his face, and his eyes shining with sadness and despair. Bao, thoughtful, told his comrades that they would wait. He explained that Boss Pei had foreseen this. They've done everything they can. Now they just have to rely on luck and wait a little longer. If they fail, all they can do is pull themselves together. Meanwhile, the teacher was clicking his fingers on the keyboard and drawing up some kind of plan. The boy exclaimed, looking at the monitor, that this game is worth being on the playlist of products of the gods. The teacher was quite pleased with what he had just understood. Products of the gods, game developers, and large-scale performance. Even though he is facing the biggest crisis of his career, he hopes that in a few hours his reputation will be completely transformed. The young man greeted everyone in his video and said that, as always, Teacher Cow was with the audience. First, he had something to announce. They were holding a large-scale performance for April Fool's Day. The performance's theme is, which of two videos, the short, angry, and crazy one, or the informative one, which cost millions of dollars to create, will become popular in the information age? The boys were shocked by this announcement. Cao said that he was unfortunately announcing the result of the experiment. This will be the first. One of the guys was very surprised by the performance and asked what kind of jokes it was. The teacher began to explain that this time the performance was organized by Tengda. Its purpose was to delve into a rather profound topic. He and several other bloggers uploaded videos with the following content. They were filled with exaggerations and followed the same script. All the videos were identical. It was supposed to be something pointless. However, when all the bloggers posted their videos, the unusual content attracted attention and people became interested. As a result, it became a trend, a vicious and crazy short video. Stupid enough for people to follow the trend, it became a meme. A conversation immediately began online. Was this another advertisement for this piece of trash? Viewers decided to see how much of a disgrace he would be this time. The teacher continued to say that, on the other hand, the new game from Tengda, the game developer, is rich in content. It reveals the current state of the industry and satirizes its chaos. Whether it's the voiceover, the style, or the gameplay, it's all creative and genuine. But how is such a rich game doing? Mixed reviews and disapproval from players. He decided to analyze it later and explain to everyone why the game developer is a product of the gods. In front of us was the Swan Lake restaurant. Pei Qian sat there, happily drinking a glass of wine. He asked everyone to make themselves at home during this meeting. He asked why everyone was so depressed. Did they really not like the dish? The boy approached old Bai and asked him to help others. He'd already tried everything here, so he knew what was most precious. Just let him see him eating ice cream. Pei Qian approached Kun and said that Ma and Yi Kun were their new employees. He was a top student and very smart too. He asked them to take care of him. Then he approached Huang Sibo and said he would leave director Zhu Xiaochu in his hands, as everything needed to be carefully planned. He asked the boy if he understood. Huang Sibo smiled and told his boss that he did. Pei Qian thought to himself that he hadn't been this happy in a long time. So far, everything was going smoothly. The internet cafe is losing around 300,000 a month and doesn't look like it will be profitable at all. Even though the series is popular, they refuse all sponsors, so they break even. The game developer's reputation is still quite mediocre, and sales are even worse. If they continued like this, the gamble would never pay off. The boy decided that was just fine. Pei Qian continued to enjoy the evening, and a confident, joyful smile never left his lips. The other guys noticed that the boss was happy today, and it was very strange. He was completely different from his previous behavior. Bai told the employee he had misunderstood. Lu Mingliang asked what he meant. Bai Shu explained that Boss Pei was the only one who couldn't afford to lose heart. The game developer's release was a failure. The game failed to live up to expectations in terms of both reputation and sales. Everyone's in a bad mood. He's their leader. Does he think they could relax and unwind if Boss Pei was depressed right now? Lu Mingliang agreed with him and said that Boss Pei was trying to look at everything on the bright side. Bai replied that this was indeed the case. When faced with difficulties, as a true leader, he must believe in the best. When faced with success, he must be attentive. At the same time, he is an idealist. He achieves everything regardless of personal interests. That's why they can't disappoint Boss Pei. Lin Wan said they'll get through this and everything will be fine. Bai Shu added, raising his glass, that Boss Pei hadn't given up yet. It was too early to talk about defeat. Lu Mingliang also raised his glass and said that Boss Pei hadn't given up. How could they say the game had already failed? Lin Wan offered them a glass of wine and exclaimed that they were right. They could turn things around and they needed to believe in Boss Pei. The boys clinked their glasses together, and the wine began to splash around from their desire not to give up. Huang Sibo asked the guys if they thought it would be appropriate to talk to Boss Pei about this now. The employee responded that he thought it was the perfect time. The game developer's release hadn't gone well. Although Pei's boss doesn't show it, he's sure he's disappointed to some degree. Good news can boost morale. It can also help Boss Pei believe in himself. The idea that this will help him believe in himself is an exaggeration. Huang Sibo said they will continue in the same spirit while others develop the site. The boys decided that's what they would say. They raised their glasses again and clinked them together. Huang Sibo extended his glass to the boss and asked him to drink with them. Pei Xian immediately agreed and approached the boys. He clinked glasses with his coworkers. After that, they drank a glass in one gulp and Huang Sibo decided to talk to the boss. He said, looking into his eyes, that he had very good news for him. Pei Qian immediately became wary. What good news was he talking about when today was such a beautiful day? He hoped the boy wouldn't ruin it for him, but the boss smiled and tried not to give himself away. He told the employee to tell the story. The boy raised his finger and started telling his boss what was actually going on. The developing website wants to sign an exclusive contract with them. The Life of Boss Pei will be published exclusively on this website. Although the site is still in its infancy, it's growing well and has launched its own programs. These programs guarantee authors compensation based on the number of views. In short, they take advantage of Boss Pei's popularity and they get money from him. Pei Qian asked what letter his name began with. He silently thought, anything but B. Huan Sibo replied, don't stand there and don't be with anyone else. It's a small site called Eili Island. It's called an ice site. The boy immediately thought about this ice site and the island of Eili. He'd never heard of such a thing before, so the boss immediately agreed. He thought, if this isn't site A or B, and besides, Isle of Eili sounds kinda lame. The guys unanimously asked their boss not to worry. They promised to work hard. The boys exclaimed, looking at their leader, that they would be simply invincible. Suddenly, the guy laughed and exclaimed that they'd been noticed by the official platform. Being on the main page would make them popular. He was simply shocked and couldn't understand what was happening. They noticed it, and on the main page, no less. When Lu Ming Liang showed his boss the good news, the boy was very surprised and grimaced in displeasure. He was always afraid of good news. Just don't let them say something happened. Lu Ming Liang told his boss that his strategy was incredible. At first, they couldn't figure out what he had in mind. But unexpectedly, everything went according to his plan. Pei Qian's face twisted into a displeased smile again. Lu Ming Liang said that he noticed that the sales of their games had increased sharply and their reputation had improved. So he decided to check and realized that someone had understood the game's concept and the significance of the marketing performance he was resorting to. Baichu exclaimed that the players had finally understood their game. His efforts had not been in vain. Pei Qian couldn't understand what had happened and why such a disaster was happening on such a beautiful day. He hadn't done anything, and what kind of marketing stunt was this? The boy spread his arms out to the sides and asked the guys to calm down and speak more slowly. Lu Ming Liang immediately took out his phone and started showing it to the boss so that he would understand everything faster. The employee was very happy when he handed over the phone, and the other guys were also happy. Pei Qian began to take out the earphone and put it in his ear to listen to everything as well. The boy realized it was Teacher Cow's video. In this game, the hated narrator represents the greed deep within their souls. He heard how he, too, could be considered an outsider, someone who only talks but does nothing. To immerse players in the game, we used the environment and added a narrative. This atmosphere is very easy to immerse yourself in. He feels a connection to the game and how it came about. He's been thinking about it, and it's probably because of the similarities between creating games and videos. One might say it's because of the similarity of any cultural creator. It's all loneliness. As they say, it's the creator's destiny to be obscure. Perhaps that was Tengda's goal when creating the game. Perhaps they assumed the game would sell poorly and wouldn't even break even. Nevertheless, they were trying to do just one thing. Allow their always rushing society to slow down and reflect. Where are they heading, and how are they supposed to live in such a turbulent society? What are they chasing? When did gaming companies become so creative? The positive comments started pouring in. Pei Qian was seriously upset and clutched his head, unable to understand what was happening behind his back. He thought about how Teacher Cao, who had initially been cursed, had suddenly become an artist. And everything had changed. Even consumption had become creative. He can't even explain it. Even if he did, the players wouldn't believe him. They'd think it was just another performance. As expected, the boss had held his ground all this time. That's what Lu Mingliang thought of him. He's always so emotional when he meets someone understanding. Baishu suddenly approached his boss and said that there was more good news. The boy became even more upset and thought about how much worse it could be and what could happen. Lu Mingliang mentioned that Ezro's official platform had just published an article. They mentioned and praised the game developer. They even featured the game on the front page. Baishu added that they liked it so much that they even planned to create a couple more recommendations of their games later. The boys exclaimed to their boss that their reputation had finally returned. The boy closed his eyes and exhaled, lost in thought. Then he opened his eyes and looked at his employees. He exclaimed that this was very good. The boys thought it was expected that Boss Pei would remain unperturbed no matter what. As they thought, Boss Pei's happy face was just a facade. And now, he was definitely calm. Lu Mingliang asked Pei Qin if he would make a toast, but the boy replied that there was no need. He needed to stay focused, and they could go and rest. The guys unanimously answered their boss that they would do just that, and they understood him. Lu Mingliang hugged Brother Bao and asked him to drink some liquor with him. The boy immediately agreed, saying they needed to get drunk today. Huang Xibo also raised his glass as high as he could and asked his employees to come over and drink. The staff clapped their hands and said that Brother Huang Xibo was simply incredible. Pei Qin wondered what was going on. He'd only paid Teacher Sao for one video, so why were there two? A 2-for-1 deal. The publication even put them on the front pages and praised him. But the efforts were again in vain. The 14th of April arrived. The day was sunny and the sky was blue and clear. The guys were getting ready to film the next scene. They were getting ready for another shoot. The employee exclaimed that filming for the 3rd season of Boss Pei's life was officially finished and thanked everyone for their work. Chu Xiaoce said that Boss Pei's acting is getting better and better. There won't be any problems at all in the 4th season. He doesn't have time to film the 4th season. Pei Qin decided to deal with the game developer first. He noticed that sales were growing and had already surpassed 100,000. The game would start turning a profit after 300,000. The employees stood opposite each other, talking about the success of what was happening. Lu Mingliang asked his brother Huang Xibo what he would do next and whether he would continue filming. The boy replied that he wasn't sure yet. They were considering 2 options, either continue moving in this direction or start in a new one. But judging by the favorable conditions that the island of Ailey will provide them, the new season will be able to cover all their expenses and even bring in a profit. Pei Qin was even more afraid if this would cover the expenses and bring in profit. He looked at the employee and asked him not to tell him he'd agreed to this low-grade collaboration. The initial investment was 1 million yuan. Huan Xibo said no, and he had already said that the island had a program to encourage video production. Pei Qin considered an incentive program. He said they would receive 15 to 30 yuan for every 10,000 views. But Huang Xibo told his boss no. Ailey Island spends a large sum of money acquiring outstanding web series to promote itself. They offered a very generous payment. The Upper Islanders believe that short series like Boss Pei's life will be a new trend in the future, so they've made an exception for them and elevated their status. Each episode is about a minute long, so any view over 30 seconds will count. Each view costs 0.2 yuan. Lu Mingliang added that in other words, if all 10 episodes get 1 million views, they will be able to make 2 million in profit. Chu Xiaoce exclaimed that everything was correct, and even after deducting all the expenses, they would still be in the black. The staff attributed this to Boss Pei's clever strategy. By rejecting all offers to collaborate with Boss Pei's life, they were able to produce a great series. Ultimately, they received recognition from the Ailey Island administration and large bonuses, and all thanks to his foresight. Huang Xibo said that the 3rd season will officially be released on Ailey Island at 8 p.m. tonight, and he hopes everyone can come and support. The staff replied that they would certainly come. Lu Mingliang clenched his fist and said he would be the first to comment. Well, suddenly their boss put his hand on Huang Xibo's shoulder and asked what the address of this site was. The employee showed him the address and the boy was simply surprised, his eyes wide open. When he saw the website address, he apparently remembered something and turned to his employees. He asked if the island's name was Ailey, and Huang Xibo replied that it was. Pei Qin turned away from his employees and exclaimed that everything was clear to him. Meanwhile, the guys were sitting at their desks, each doing their own thing. Pei Qin walked over to his computer and opened the monitor to see a familiar page. He assumed this was B's website, and Shenhua Corporation and Chengdu are investing in it. This is a larger version of the B website. The boy looked at his computer and began to call up his system. The wealth transformation system appeared before him. It issued a new task for the week. The company needed to acquire a brick-and-mortar store located in a busy part of the city or near a university. Tycoon thought the system was still losing money. But that would soon change. 2 games had already generated a profit of around 9 million in 2.5 months. Adding the system's initial budget of 1 million, it comes to around 10 million. Current spending on Fei Huang is around 1 million. Game developer development and advertising costs around 3 million and a bit. Current investment in internet cafes is around 3.5 million. Add to that rent, salaries, and other things. 2 million for 2.5 months. Tycoon thought that if he added it all up, it would be almost 10 million. He wanted to spend a lot of money, but now the profit is 800,000. Ms. Chin suddenly knocked on the door and asked Boss Pei if he was busy. She came to confirm the company bonuses they'd mentioned earlier. If everything was okay, they'd continue. The boy immediately agreed. He considered including company bonuses and standard medical checkups worth 3,000 yen per employee, a 3,000 yen gift card, and other bonuses. A total of 500,000. Another 500,000, well, that's a drop in the bucket. Judging by the game developer's current sales and the popularity of Pei's boss's life, he thinks he'll earn another 2 or 3 million. He told the girl that everything was fine, but he thought to himself that he didn't have a plan B. Why did everything turn out this way? Shin told her boss there was one more thing. A journalist from Entertainment Time contacted them today, and she wanted to interview him. This was the 3rd journalist this week. Should they continue to turn him down? Tycoon asked the employee to refuse all interviews and ensure that the following conditions were met. Firstly, no one is allowed to disclose his name and identity. Secondly, no one is allowed to publicize his company bonuses and salary. He asked to remind everyone of this again. Shin told the boss that they would do so. The girl, after finishing her conversation with the boss, headed for the exit. When the door closed, the boy was left alone in his thoughts and began to worry again. If someone finds out about the salaries and bonuses, outstanding talent will flock to them in the hopes of being hired. He can't even decide what to do right now. He still needs to hide the fact that he founded the company from his parents. Too much popularity will cause a lot of problems, and people will be watching him, making it harder to get around. But still, one must be optimistic, and he will consider this a payment of 5,000 yen to employees. Tycoon decided he was a great boss. If he couldn't go into the red this time, he'd try harder next time. The boy thought that negative experiences are necessary, and that one needs to analyze and learn. Tycoon realized he needed to figure out why the game developer had become successful, or understand their weaknesses so he could exploit them. The boy started playing the game. In this game, he plays a game developer, and his goal is to navigate a variety of circumstances and choose the most successful game development method. The game's goal is to give the player a full understanding of the decision-making process. After all, that's what the developer does. If that's all, then this game is a great simulator. Compared to other classic simulators, it has superior graphics and no other advantages. Tycoon thought about how they were professional analysts, and their only flaw was considered part of the game. With such analysis, people would think he'd bribed them. He'd be better off looking at player reviews. They're usually hard to please, so they should find plenty of flaws. It's simply outrageous because what he tried so hard to make repulsive to the viewer ended up becoming the game's gimmick. Does anyone really like the narrator? Okay, so tomorrow he'll give Lu Ming Liang his debut and turn him into a virtual idol. The graphics are decent and the gameplay is excellent. The hated narrator has become the game's gimmick, so what's the point? Are they really trying to tell me that he created the perfect game and it's just a bad joke? Meanwhile, April 19th arrived. The staff gathered around the table. Huang Xibo asked Brother Bao about his medical results. The boy replied that he had a mild to moderate stomach problem. The doctor said he wasn't sleeping enough and wasn't eating well, and Bao asked what was wrong. Huang Xibo replied that he had mild fatty liver disease and high blood pressure, but nothing serious. Bao replied as if he'd heard that he needed to get checked every 6 months in the future. Huang Xibo asked his friend not to react that way. These tests were only for their own benefit. If he hadn't been tested now, he wouldn't have known he had fatty degeneration and needed to pay attention to it. The boy asked how Yi-kun was doing. The boy replied that he was fine, just having some stomach problems, just like Brother Bao. Huang Xibo mentioned that at Shan Yuan game, they had to work late and eat poorly. No wonder they're having problems. They just need to improve their diet. Yi-kun said that Tengda is the best company. They get good salaries and medical examinations. Boss Pei is a great boss who cares about his employees. Huang Xibo supported the boy, and smiling, replied that it was not even worth talking about. Is it their day off today? It really is, and they can order a taxi home, and the company will cover their expenses. The young man said goodbye to his co-workers and said he was getting ready to leave, but they wanted to go with him. The boys invited Yi-kun to come along, but the boy replied that he'd forgotten his umbrella at the hospital. He ran for an umbrella and asked the boys not to wait for him, but to leave themselves. So he said goodbye to his employees and headed towards the hospital. When Yi-kun entered the room, he thought that thank God the umbrella was still here. Suddenly, someone approached him, and after greeting him, asked if he was an employee of Tengda. A girl greeted them and said her name was Hu Yue, a journalist from Jingzhou Entertainment. She wanted an exclusive interview about the company. The girl asked if she could ask him about it. Kun asked how she knew he was a Tengda employee. Hu Yue adjusted her glasses and replied that she had a friend who worked at the hospital. She told her that Tengda employees were being examined today, so she came immediately. Yichun apologized and said that the company rules prohibit disclosure of information about their superiors. They also can't disclose their salaries and bonuses, so he'd better find someone else. But the girl asked the boy to wait and grabbed him by the sleeve of his clothes. She said it wouldn't be a problem if he didn't reveal any information about his boss or salaries. He might be vague. Yichun asked if she was too dedicated to her work. Tengda was just a regular gaming company, so why would they need their exclusives? Huye explained that she needed the interview to help the domestic industry thrive. The boy immediately stopped, glanced at the girl and asked what the meaning was. Huye began explaining that players had previously criticized the domestic gaming industry. The games were bad, the developers lacked creativity, and they were only interested in profit. As someone who worked in gaming media, she was deeply frustrated by her own helplessness. But Tengda's arrival revealed a completely different group. They were well organized and creative, and they considered money a waste of money and games a work of art. She hopes that Tengda will become a benchmark for the domestic gaming industry to move in the right direction. This company will allow players who love domestic games to believe in them again. Therefore, if it can secure an exclusive interview, it could have an impact on the domestic gaming industry. Yikin told his comrades about this and said he would think about it. He asked Brother Bao if he thought he'd agree to an interview. The boy looked off into the distance and considered the matter. After a short pause, he replied to his comrade that he thought nothing bad would happen if he agreed. Yikun said that Boss Pei had warned them. They were forbidden from disclosing information about him, including his salary and bonuses. Baishu asked him not to be a fool. He needed to try to understand Boss Pei's true intentions. Then the boy thought for a moment and asked about Boss Pei's true intentions. Baishu asked why he thought the boss had forbidden them from telling anyone about him. Because Boss Pei was modest. He's a charismatic game developer. If he reveals his identity, players might focus their attention on him rather than the games. He doesn't want players to become fanatics and mindlessly worship an idol. He hopes to keep everyone at arm's length so that the game's reviews are objective. Kun then asked why Pei's boss forbids him from disclosing information about the company's salary and bonuses. Baishu replied that he thought Boss Pei was taking the entire domestic gaming industry into account. Tengda's current bonuses are incomparable to any other company, and they're all gone. The boy listened to him in amazement. He asked his friend what he thought would happen if the bonuses became public knowledge. Kun replied that all the talented people would flock to the company, and wouldn't that be a good thing? Bai said that if you rush things, you'll make people laugh. If everyone were to tell everyone that Tengda had raised salaries and bonuses to the maximum possible, it would impact employees at other companies as well. This would negatively impact the gaming industry as a whole and have its own consequences. Yikun exclaimed that he now understood. The company's influence would certainly improve the industry as a whole, but it was still too early. There's no need to rush, but rather take things gradually. Baishu replied that he understood correctly, so they should agree to the interview. Pei's boss said it was forbidden to talk about salaries and bonuses. Teng has many other positive aspects. To attract talent, they need visibility. He was sure that Boss Pei hadn't turned down the opportunity. Yikun was delighted and exclaimed that he understood everything and would definitely handle the interview. Meanwhile, evening had come and the company's employees continued to work, sitting at their monitors. Peikin addressed his system while drinking tea and sitting on his sofa. A wealth transformation system appeared before him. This week's special assignment was to open brick-and-mortar stores near a busy area or university. The assignment was completed. Peikin decided that if he had followed his original plan, he would have achieved his goal. Who would have thought that a game developer would suddenly start making money? There's only a week left until the count, and he's afraid there will be another million in income. This means that by the final tally date, The system account will have approximately 3 million. If you subtract the initial million, you'll get 20,000. The boy thought about 20,000 in 3 months. 7,000 a month is pretty good. Suddenly someone knocked on his office door again, and the boy answered for the employee to come in. Huang Xibo burst into his office and exclaimed to the boss that he had good news. Tycoon was already tired of this good news, and his eyes became much bigger. Huang Xibo began explaining that the first 3 episodes of the 3rd season of Boss Pay's life were already online. Each episode had already received over 1 million views. According to the agreement, the island of Eiley will pay them 530,000 for the past week, and the money will be transferred to his account. Once all 10 episodes are released, these figures will multiply. He asked his boss if he should transfer the money to the company account for his use. Tycoon was very surprised and exclaimed that there was no need to rush. They could do it gradually. Huang Xibo noticed that the boss was holding an empty cup. Last week, 3 episodes aired, earning 530,000. This week, 4 more episodes will air. They'll earn around 700,000, meaning Fei Huang will earn over 1 million before the final tally. Fei Huang is a subsidiary of Tengde. It's assumed that most of his earnings are transferred to the company account, with another 10,000 or so going to his personal account. Tycoon figured out what would happen next. To earn 10,000, he'd have to spend 1 million. He couldn't afford such short-sightedness. The boy told his employee that Fei Huang's income would be divided into 4 parts. 50% for deadly expenses and development, 2 owners, Zhu Xiaoqi and he will get 10% each. The remaining major participants will split 10% among themselves, and the remaining 20 will remain his. Huang Xibo exclaimed to the boss that this was probably inconvenient and that it couldn't be done. Boss Pay is so generous. The amount for the Fei Huang workshop employees has already exceeded the parent company's share. Tycoon thought about how the system wouldn't let him refuse the money. He didn't even want to take that 20%. Tycoon looked at his employee and exclaimed that would solve everything. Plus, they all need a raise. They need to get every penny of the money they were promised. Huang Xibo continued to look at his boss in confusion. When he came to his senses a little, he told Pei's boss that he understood. The boss asked if there were any other problems. In his mind, he was already kicking him out and thought that he had ruined everything twice, but he still smiled and praised him. And this was very annoying. Huang Xibo scratched his head and said that they were planning to film the 4th season of Boss Pei's life. But the kid replied that he wouldn't be taking part in the filming anymore. He'd helped him out in the first 3 seasons because they were just getting started. He thought to himself that they were trying to coax him into a 3rd season, but that wouldn't happen. Fei Huang's workshop was already back on its feet, and he had a lot of work, so he wouldn't be participating anymore. Huang Xibo assumed Pei's boss was helping them because they were just starting out. Although he received little in return, he worked with them and starred in 3 seasons. Boss Pei's life only succeeded thanks to his help. Huang Xibo told his boss that the show would lose its soul without him. Tycoon told Huang Xibo that he was wrong and that he should not be afraid to step out of his comfort zone. The boy asked what comfort zone he was talking about. Then the boss grabbed him by the shoulder and, looking him in the eye, began to explain. He said that if they keep doing the same thing in the 4th season, the profits will be stable, but he shouldn't forget that he gave him 1 million. Huang Xibo thought it was money for a dream. Tycoon asked him not to mention that his dream ended there. His dream is simply to make a short series and earn 1 million views. He challenged him to step out of his comfort zone and challenge himself again. That's exactly why he gave him money. Huang Xibo replied sadly that he understood everything. As the boy left the office, he clenched his fists and thought that he would never disappoint his boss. When the door closed, Tycoon was left alone with his thoughts again. He sat down on the sofa and began to think about how further events would develop. He managed to fool him. If it had continued for a 4th season, the profit would have reached 2 million. He's afraid he wouldn't have been able to cope. His thoughts were interrupted again by a knock on the door, and he clenched his teeth and asked what had happened again. Shin entered the office. She explained to the boss that the employee's medical examination reports had arrived. As he'd requested, she brought it over so he could take a look. The boy asked the girl to place it on the table. He asked Shin's assistant if she could briefly review the results of the medical examination. The girl replied that, to put it briefly, everything was fine. About 70% of employees had minor health issues, such as stomach problems, liver disease, excess weight, or high blood pressure. A small percentage of employees have more serious problems and will have to take medication. Zhopeng has the most serious problems. He has a benign tumor and needs a minor operation, but it's not dangerous. Pei Chen thought about this. He took his results and, looking at them, asked his assistant how much this operation would cost. The girl looked down and replied that she didn't know. The operation costs about 20–30,000. She thought that Pei's boss was afraid that health problems would affect his performance. She said the average age of their company's employees is 27. They are all healthy, and any minor issues will be resolved. The boy asked the system what the conditions were for covering work expenses. The system immediately appeared and indicated that work-related injuries are included in the number of industrial injuries. Hand pain from working with a mouse, muscle pain, a herniated disc, stomach problems. All of these can be considered work-related injuries. Tycoon was delighted and thought that if all this counted, he could spend a couple of thousand on each employee. That meant he could spend another 200,000 or 300,000. Even if it was less, it was worth a try. The boss asked Assistant Shin to tell everyone that there would be a meeting at 3 o'clock and to ask Ma Yan and Huang Xibo to come too. The girl answered the boss that she understood him and asked what the meeting was about. Tycoon replied that they urgently needed to discuss compensation for work-related injuries. Shin thought about this as she left. At 3 o'clock that same day, the tall building of the Tengda company rose up in front of us. All the employees gathered around a long wooden table and prepared for the meeting. Huang Xibo thanked Assistant Shin for giving him a blank sheet of paper. Yikun asked Lu Mingyang if Boss Pei had gathered them together to start work on a new project. The boy replied that he had no idea, but if it were a new project, it would be good. He doesn't think, in principle, that if this were the case, Wan and Ma would be here. Tycoon chuckled to make the boys stop talking and looked in their direction. The boy said he'd looked over their medical results. The situation wasn't very favorable. The boy stood up from the table and slammed his hand as hard as he could on the wooden surface. He exclaimed that no one pays attention to their health. It's already been said not to work overtime. And why do illnesses still occur? The staff thought it was nothing serious. Just high blood pressure, liver disease, a little excess weight, and carpal tunnel syndrome. The boys couldn't understand why Boss Pei was talking, as if everyone was going to die soon. The boss asked Bao Shu if he had any stomach problems. He said it was probably due to overwork and poor nutrition. It was clearly a work-related injury, and he needed to take care of his body. The company would cover any medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance. Tycoon asked Shin's assistant to discuss the matter with the hospital and ensure the best possible treatment. The girl immediately agreed. Bai Shu, horrified, wondered if he simply had a weak stomach and a slow metabolism. Why would he need treatment? Or was he trying to kill them with pills? The boss told the others that Ma Yi-kun also had stomach problems and needed treatment. When the boy heard what they said about him, he immediately cast a questioning glance at his boss. Tycoon thought for a moment and, looking straight ahead, exclaimed that he'd almost forgotten. Bao Shu's hair was falling out badly. This is also due to overwork. This could also be considered an occupational injury, and he asks to go to the hospital and get checked out. He needs to combat his baldness. After this, the boy approached Huang Xibo and said that his liver disease also needed treatment. He also looked pale and had oily skin. He was probably worried or tired, and this was also an occupational injury. The boy told his boss it was because he forgot to wash his face. But Tycoon continued to say that this skin condition could affect the company's image and that he needed to take care of his skin. The company would cover the costs. Tycoon turned to Xiaolu. He exclaimed that, judging by the report, he had pharyngitis, and it was probably due to his voiceover work. He asked him not to worry. It was an industrial injury, and he should get proper treatment. The company would cover all expenses. In addition, most of them suffer from carpal tunnel syndrome, which affects their productivity, and he asks to get checked as soon as possible. And Zhou has the most serious case. He leaned forward and looked at the boy. Zhou didn't expect this, and looked at his boss with surprise and questioning eyes. Tycoon explained that he had a tumor and needed surgery. He told the boy not to worry. The company would cover anything his insurance didn't cover. It was also an industrial injury, and due to overwork, he could take paid leave. Linwan fearfully asked the boy why he hadn't told her about the tumor. The boys asked how he had carried this burden alone. They told the guy they would support him. The employee asked when he would start treatment and be hospitalized. She exclaimed that they would definitely come to see him. Chauvin replied that he only had a benign tumor, and it made no difference whether he removed it or not. It's most likely a hematoma. It's about 5 centimeters, and if it's less than 4 centimeters, there's no point in hospitalization. There was silence in the meeting room, and the staff all began to ask questions. Tycoon continued to ponder something, and then told the employees that everyone needed to change their attitude toward themselves. Their bodies weren't theirs alone. Employees are a company's most important resource. They have signed an employment contract, so the company is responsible for their health. Mayan and Huang Shibo will monitor the health of employees at the Internet Cafe and Fei Huang workshop to ensure everything meets their standards. The guys were very surprised and agreed with the boss. They promised to do everything. Peikin raised his finger and announced that they would now discuss the company's new bonuses. First, work-related injuries. Any work-related health issue is considered an occupational injury. First, you need to submit a request for health insurance, and the company will reimburse any expenses it doesn't cover. The exact amount will be communicated later. In addition, Assistant Shin was required to provide all employees with gym memberships and pay for 8 classes per month. They were required to go twice on Mondays. The young woman immediately agreed with her boss. The boss continued, regarding diet. Most employees have weak stomachs, and it's all due to poor nutrition. Mayan is an excellent cook at the Internet Cafe and is asking for 2 more to be hired. He needs to prepare lunch for the employees every day, ensuring it's balanced and delivered regularly to the office. The company will cover everything. They will also hire a nutritionist to monitor the nutrition of their employees. He asked Shin's assistant to write this down and select candidates. The girl immediately wrote it down and replied that she understood. The boy said that that was all for today, and they could go peacefully. Pei-chan smiled and thought that the system didn't stop him, so he could spend another $500,000. In this cycle, he will not be able to change anything, but he will work for the future. When the employees walked out the door, the boss was left alone with a slight smile on his lips. The children were very touched by what happened. Lin Wan said it was very touching. How is it even possible to have such a good boss who puts the health of his employees first? This is simply incredible, and we need to work hard at the interview tomorrow to ensure everyone gets into the spirit of Pei and Tengda's boss. The next bright sunny day arrived, namely the 20th of April. Yichun and Hu Ye were sitting at a table in a cafe. He went to give the interview after all. The girl sat opposite the boy, and having prepared a paper and pen, said that they would now begin the interview. First, she would like to ask how long he has been working at Tengda and what he does there. The boy put his hand to his head and replied that he had been working there for about a month and was studying. The girl did not expect such an answer and asked the boy to clarify a little. Yichun began to explain that the work process at Tengda was organized in the best possible way. Newcomers weren't allowed to work. They could only learn. He tries hard every day because he needs to study Boss Pei's development ideas and then learn from his elders to see Boss Pei's true intentions. He feels awkward because he still has to consult with his seniors to understand what Boss Pei is up to. Hu Yi asked to talk about a currently popular game developer. The game's marketing strategy was performance. Was this what the company had been striving for from the very beginning? Yi Kun spread his arms wide and replied no. He explained to the journalist that, in reality, they were all somewhat in the dark. Boss Pei had chosen this performance marketing scheme and kept it hidden from everyone else. He put his hands to his head and said that he felt awkward again. They were of little help. The journalist continued to write down everything the boy said. She asked if he could tell her a little more about Boss Pei. As she thought, the company was full of geniuses, and their boss was one of them. Yi Kun said that Boss Pei was a genius developer. Sometimes they manage to create a good game simply because they follow Boss Pei's instructions. Take the Ocean Fortress, for example. Sometimes Boss Pei does everything himself, and he's very attentive to detail. He'll personally polish the game to perfection, just like he did at the game developer. Boss Pei also possesses a unique charisma. Ruan Guangjiang is a professional artist. Teacher Kao is a wonderful blogger, and they are his best friends. A friendship free from personal interests. Boss Pei is a solitary genius. His ideals transcend time, so some often misinterpret his ideas. However, he doesn't care and continues to surpass himself. The journalist thought he was praising him highly, but the interview was anonymous. Even if Pei's boss found out about the interview, he wouldn't know who was giving it. So Ma Yichun was sincere about all this. Hu Ye thought that she had never seen such harmony between employees and management. The girl mentioned that the popular series, Boss Life Pei, was apparently inspired by Tengda. Is there any collaboration between them? Yichun replied that there was, and she could find it online. Boss Pei's Life is produced by the Fei Huang workshop, and Fei Huang is a subsidiary of Tengda. Hu Wei exclaimed that this was expected, and that the series was so popular in part because it used Pei's boss's personal experience. Yichun apologized and said that he could not answer because it might reveal something about Boss Pei. The journalist replied that she understood and said she would now ask her final question. If he were to rate Pei's boss on a scale of 1 to 100, what would he rate him? The boy replied that perhaps some bosses deserved 90 points, for example, if they pay overtime, give bonuses, and so on. He began to remember everything good that the boss had done for them and exclaimed that he deserved at least 200 points. If someone had told him earlier that a boss like Boss Pay existed, he wouldn't have even believed it. The next day, April 22nd, arrived. The sky was blue and clear, and there was no sign of trouble. The employees entered the internet cafe and noticed their boss, Pay, sitting at the bar. They felt awkward, so the guy asked Brother Ma what they should do. Boss Pay probably came to criticize them, and he asked his comrade to think about what could be done, since they were close. Ma Yan asked him not to worry and said he would handle it himself. Even if the internet cafe closes, don't forget his friendship with the boss. He'll get them jobs elsewhere, and they've probably disappointed him. Huang Sibo made a great series, and the game became popular. They're just making a loss, and he's upset. The comrade told Brother Ma he didn't want to blame anyone, but they tried to suggest something, but the boss kept rejecting it. Ma Yan replied that he was wrong and asked to take a look at Huang Sibo. Although he didn't think he was much better than them, he was doing a good job. The boss forbade them from accepting small sponsorships to protect their reputation, but they still tried and filmed 2 seasons. Then they signed an exclusive contract with the Isle of Ailey for a 3rd season and immediately recouped their investment. The employee replied that he was right, and now he understands that it was his fault. The guy thought that the internet cafe was making big losses, and that Boss Pay would undoubtedly reorganize everything here, change the staff, but leave Ma Yan because they were close. Only he would suffer in this case. Ma Yan approached his boss and began to tell him what he thought. He said that he knew that he was upset because he had entrusted him with the management of the internet cafe, but he would take responsibility for all the losses. He could quit, but Zhang Yuan is talented, so let him stay. Pei Qian didn't expect that and smiled. He told his boss that it was his fault that the internet cafe was poorly organized. Even though they're close, he can't let the company fall apart because of him. He takes full responsibility. Pei Qian asked the boy to calm down and what he was talking about. He had the most confidence in him, and he hadn't even upset him. He already told him, even though the internet cafe is currently losing money, it's still the company's most important project compared to the other 2. He called Zhang Yuan over. He thought to himself that he had initially placed his hopes on Bao Chu and Huang Sibo, but they had disappointed him. The upset guy approached the boss and looked sadly into his eyes. The boy explained, looking at him and Ma Yan, that they were the only useful employees left. Cheng Yuan and Ma Yang exchanged dumbfounded glances. They couldn't understand why Pei Qian considered them valuable employees after the internet cafe's massive losses. Of course, the friends couldn't know what their boss was happy about as he enjoyed their signature cocktail with a smile. Ma Yan was the first to come to his senses and looked at his companion in surprise, asking the boss to tell him what he meant. Pei Qian didn't even turn towards the guy and made him wait for an answer until he himself had gulped down the contents of his cocktail glass. Placing his empty glass on the table, the man thanked the staff for their excellent work and wished them continued success. Ma Yan couldn't help but shudder when he heard that Pei Qian wanted to open similar internet cafes in other parts of the city. The boss told Zhang Yuan confidentially that this was just preparation. The real battle for the city was still ahead. Pei Qian was very pleased with the cafe. The losses were a full 300,000 yuan, not counting the 3 million he'd invested. Ma Yan blushed, making a heart shape with his thumb and forefinger. Pei Qian gave a thumbs up and exclaimed that he had high hopes for the staff. He explained that 300,000 wasn't such a big loss. Profits don't come immediately. You need to invest capital first. The young man gave the employees a reassuring pat on the shoulder, stating that the internet cafe was an important part of Tengda's company. Both boys blushed when the boss allowed them to do whatever they wanted and promised to compensate them for any amount. He turned to the other 4 and vowed not to fire anyone, even if the losses were catastrophic. All 4 of them smiled with relief when they heard that Pei Qian had also promised to increase everyone's salary by 30%. The man confidently declared, shaking his fist, that in the future, anyone could become a manager. They would open another cafe next month. The entire staff was very pleased with the boss's visit. Everyone was openly happy to stay on and earn a high salary. Pei Qian patted Ma Yan on the shoulder as he said goodbye and said he had to go. The boy still couldn't figure out what was going on in his friend's head. As he left the internet cafe, the man straightened his tie and smiled. It was time to devise a new plan to avoid losing to Huang Sibo. Ma Yan and Zhang Yuan cried with joy. The bartender tearfully promised to sing better and try to get more drinks. Assistant Xin Hai Liu asked the boss where they were going next and took him to the Tengda company office. She opened the passenger door. Pei Qian stepped out of the car, still thinking about the cafe and how he'd managed to cheer up the staff. The girl pressed the elevator button. The boss thought with satisfaction that no amount of effort would help the cafe staff attract customers. Pei Qian smiled as he exited the elevator with his assistant. He knew perfectly well he'd set his prices too high. Besides, the cafe was located in the middle of nowhere. He glanced at the girls behind the reception desk and thought that after opening another establishment, he would quickly go bankrupt. When the man crossed the threshold of the office, he immediately realized that something strange was happening and froze in surprise. Chief Planner Lu Ming Liang sat at his desk. Everyone else crowded around him and discussed something. Pei Qian became wary and immediately stopped smiling. He suspected the developers were right to be so happy. Also standing next to Yi Kun were Huang Shibo and director Xiao Che. This simultaneous appearance was more than odd. The man became wary. Sweat began to pour down his face. Pei Qian began to frantically think about what could have gone wrong. Bao Shu was the first to notice him and joyfully shouted that the boss had returned. Pei Qian shuddered. He realized something terrible had happened. Huang Xibo bowed to the chief, acknowledging his admiration for his brilliant idea. The man stared at him silently, uncomprehending. Min Liang rose from the table, surrounded by the others, confirming the designer's words. He had never imagined that a simple warning would prove so important. Even the newly hired Yi Kun boldly gave a thumbs up and exclaimed that the boss had thought of everything 1,000 steps ahead. Pei Qian was getting worse, barely able to stand. Forcing a pathetic smile, the man asked what had happened. Bao Yu eagerly handed his phone to his boss and asked him to look at the headline. Pei Qian hesitantly extended his hand. The article mentioned his gaming company Tengda. Furthermore, the reviewer was effusive in his praise. The young man skimmed the article. Fortunately, there was no mention of company bonuses, and no one had mentioned his name. Bao Yu happily gave a thumbs up and exclaimed that he now understood why it was necessary to hide the employees' bonuses. Huang Xibo and Min Liang also gave the game a thumbs up. The chief planner declared that their latest game had been very popular. Several people simultaneously exclaimed that they loved it, their eyes shining with genuine delight. Pei Qian looked at the employees with concern. He was beginning to realize that the company had attracted too much attention. The man's eyes darted around in confusion. Pei Qian frantically wondered what this success might lead to. Bao Yu exclaimed in admiration that the game and the recent series seemed like fireballs to him. And now, they had flared up even more intensely. Pei Qian attempted a smile. The words struck him straight in the heart, emptying one of his 4 life cells. Min Liang exclaimed triumphantly that after the article was published, Tengda's company would attract the attention of players and viewers of the series. For the man, these words were like a stab in the back. Another cell of his life disappeared forever. The employees continued to pester him. Bao Shu demonstrated how popular the company had become. Many people loved their games and TV series. Lin Wan confirmed that even Lonely Road has regained its fame, and the number of TV viewers is constantly increasing. Pei Qian had lost all his vitality and saw himself framed in mourning. He understood that such wild success meant the end of everything. The employees were buzzing with excitement about how sooner or later the boss would have to show his face to the world. They were wondering when that would happen. Pei Qian nearly cried with resentment. Now the boss saw himself in a huge hole, and all the employees were trying to bury him alive, laughing joyfully. Director Xiao Che took out his camera with a smile and suggested taking a group photo to celebrate such a successful day. All the developers loved this brilliant idea. Bao Shu called the boss and asked him to take a seat right in the center. Everyone crowded around Pei Qian and his assistant. Even the director himself managed to get into the frame. The entire staff was very pleased. The young man suggested the staff continue celebrating their shared success. Unfortunately, he can't join in. He's too busy. Pei Qian heard the staff discussing the successful photo behind him. Kun suggested posting it to the general chat. Director Xiao Qi only now realized that something was wrong with the photo. Their boss seemed sad, even though everyone else was happy about the success. Pei Qian first headed to the office water cooler, next to which stood a huge pot with an exotic plant. There was no other way out, so the young man urgently convened a second meeting of his doubles in his head. The 4 clones bowed their heads in confusion over the round table. One of them, puzzled, said that the game and the series were already generating revenue. The second double admitted that the system account was impossible to exhaust. The third clone claimed things were even worse. After the interview, consumer interest in their company increased dramatically. Chairman Pei Qian angrily slammed his mallet on the table, urging the others to collect their thoughts. Everyone has their ups and downs. He smiled, suggesting a new idea. Since the system account couldn't be emptied, more money needed to be transferred to the personal account. Tycoon, wearing square glasses, noted that this had already been discussed. All their attempts to suffer losses were leading to yet another success. Tycoon's clone slowly sipped some hot drink and said that they were actually talented and would find a way out. The chairman put down his gavel and suggested they settle down for a new cycle. They needed to come up with a new plan. Tycoon, joystick in hand, quietly said that the games were too successful because they were unique. The chairman winced. The player explained that in order to destroy the company, they deliberately deviated from the canon and created unique products. He raised 2 fingers, recalling that employees were paid higher salaries and substantial bonuses to increase losses. Everyone around shouted that this was the wrong tactic, that it was unnecessary to act this way. The chairman agreed. Tycoon, wearing a red bow tie, was surprised to suggest that in that case, they should have followed development trends. The chairman folded his arms and said with displeasure that that wasn't the issue. Quite often, a clone of a game becomes more popular than the original. Everyone remained silent. It was no secret that the million-copy selling Super Mario was actually just a copy of Donkey Kong. At the meeting, a decision was made to stop developing new games. It would be better to keep the promise and update the first game. On the evening of April 30th, Tycoon asked his assistant, Shin, not to be disturbed. He wanted to calmly wrap up the proceedings. The man stared impatiently at the monitor. Thanks to the completed tasks, his personal account had almost surpassed the 90,000 mark. Tycoon skimmed the information. There were still 60 days left until the next summary. This confused him a little. This time the time had been cut by a third. Besides, there was no specific task. The young man suspected that achieving the goal would be more difficult. He rose decisively from the table, deciding to stick to his previous plan. He needed to open a few more unprofitable internet cafes. Tycoon emerged from his office and surveyed the surroundings. All the staff were busy with their work. While Lin Wan was discussing a project with Bao Shu, the man loudly demanded that everyone immediately gather in the conference room. There was something that needed to be discussed. The chief planner turned around happily at the sound of his boss's voice. He was certain a new game was on the agenda. Bao Shu and Lin Wan were also happy, their faces expressing genuine delight. The young people were thrilled to be working here. All the staff took their places at the large table, eagerly placing their notes in front of them. Tycoon thought gloomily that there wasn't much time. Besides, his projects were working against him. The game Ghost General was bringing in $600,000 a month, and the last game brought in almost $2 million in revenue. With that kind of profit, he won't be able to make any money for himself. Even the Ocean Fortress game brought in an unexpected profit of $3.5 million, which drove the man crazy. The only unprofitable business was the internet cafe, which was losing 300,000 rubles a month. This was the only project that brought joy to Tycoon. In addition, Tengda spent about $1 million a month on building rent, salaries, and employee bonuses. To break even in 2 months, they'd have to spend $14 million. The easiest way would have been to open a few new cafes. Tycoon heard his name and looked up in confusion. Apparently, he'd been lost in thought. Ming Liang waved his hand impatiently. The man smiled and apologized to the staff. He had indeed been thinking for a moment. Tycoon officially opened the meeting. He frowned, remembering that he'd promised the players updates. He knew this would bring in extra profits. Tycoon cleared his throat delicately into his fist to attract attention and said that he would like to say a few words about the vote for the best employee. The man smiled broadly and raised his hand, holding up 2 fingers. He explained that this event would be held twice a year. Everyone who takes first place on February 1st will receive $1 million. The first place winner will receive a month of paid vacation on August 1st. Bao Shu couldn't believe it and moved closer to the table. He himself had recently returned from vacation, and the proposal seemed incredible. Tycoon held up 3 fingers again and declared that it was time to talk about the company's plans for the next 2 months. The young man said that players are complaining about the lack of updates in the games, so the development team will focus solely on this. For their first game, Lonely Desert Road, Tycoon proposed adding an endless mode and multiplayer. Additionally, several more cards for the game can be developed. All these expansions will be sold for 1 yuan. The man folded his arms across his chest and explained that he had also come up with expansions for the Ghost General card game for 5 yuan each. Bao Shun gradually began to understand the boss's brilliant plan. The add-ons are inexpensive, so they will quickly become very popular. A new weapon will be added to the shooter Ocean Fortress for the symbolic price of 888 yuan. He spoke so quickly that Lin Wan could barely keep up with his notes. She was surprised that he could only make 500 purchases a month. Peikin stated that there are new features for the latest game as well. New voice acting and new character locations are needed. Ming Liang winced when he heard that this add-on would cost only 5 yuan. He knew no one would want to buy it. All 3 employees cried out in unison that this was too cheap. Developing add-ons would cost significantly more. The remaining employees exchanged worried glances. For the first time, they felt like the company was collapsing. Zhou Peng whispered that it wouldn't be cheap. Xiao Ce quickly calculated that they wouldn't make more than 200,000. All 6 key employees pretended to be pleased with this decision and exclaimed in one voice that only their boss could afford this. Pei Qian merely smirked in response. In reality, he would have set the price even lower. But the system wouldn't allow it. The man stood up from the table and announced that Ming Liang would be in charge of distributing the work. Everyone else was free to go. Pei Qian surreptitiously watched his staff. Everyone had already taken their places and were busy with their work. The man left the office, deciding to talk to Ma Yan as soon as possible and start opening new unprofitable cafes. Suddenly there was a clatter of feet behind him. Yi Kun ran up to his boss and asked if they could talk about something in private. The young man smiled. He was always happy to help his employees. Pei Qian invited the writer to follow him into his office. He sat down on a comfortable sofa near the coffee table and invited the visitor to sit down, asking him to tell him what was bothering Yi Kun. The guy timidly admitted in a quiet voice that one of his friends had recently had some problems. Pei Qian smiled, assuming the visitor wasn't referring to himself when he spoke of his friend. After pouring the employee some tea, the man offered to talk about all the problems. He was even willing to give him 3 days of paid leave. Yi Kun held up his palms, declaring that everything was wrong. He recalled that he had once worked at Shang Yang's company with Huang Shibo. Pei Qian took a sip of tea. It turned out that the technical writer's friend had recently lost his job and asked if he had anything in mind. The man looked at his interlocutor in surprise. He clearly heard that the man hadn't quit. He'd simply lost his job. Pei Qian asked why he'd been fired. Kun admitted it was much worse. His friend had lost his job because the company was closing. The man asked in surprise why Shangyang was closing. Deep down, he was crawling and crying, envying the company that had gone bankrupt. The writer said that rumors about this had been circulating within the company for a long time, and many employees had tried to move to other jobs. It turned out that the main planner was trying to sell his sword in the game for the same price as an ocean fortress. But because of this, the game's reputation suffered and profits fell. Yi Kun sighed heavily, explaining that all the employees had been called in last week. No one had even paid them their salaries. Pei Qian froze in place, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Shangyang's company had suffered losses, and they had managed to blame him for the downfall. The man calmly took another sip, but in reality, his heart was bursting with envy. He'd been trying to make losses for a month now, without success. Pei Qian suddenly realized things weren't so bad. He shouldn't envy his competitors. He could become their leader. The man smiled smugly. He liked the idea. Shangyang was a money-losing company, so he should just buy it. Yi Kun looked at his boss with hope in his eyes. Deep down, he hoped that Pei Qian wouldn't refuse his request. The man scratched his chin smugly, delighted at the loss-making business. If he bought the company, he'd start losing money quickly. The writer clasped his palms together in a pleading gesture. He asked for at least a chance for an interview with his friend. Pei Qian smiled. Placing the cup on the table, he promised the boy wouldn't be left without work. Yi Kun jumped with joy. Looking at his boss with admiring eyes, he suggested that they would find another vacancy for his friend even if he didn't pass the interview. Yi Kun thanked the man warmly for his help. Pei Qian smiled and asked for Shin's assistant to come to him. The young man promised to do so immediately. After weighing all the facts, he decided that his friend would be scheduled for an interview right then and there. When Liu Xin entered the office, the boss was already sitting at his laptop and briefly explained what he intended to do. The girl carefully wrote down all the demands in a notebook. Pei Qian asked to speak with Shang Yang, the boss, about purchasing the company. Liu Xin thoughtfully said that she never contradicted her boss, but Shang Yang's company was now barely staying afloat. Pan Qian laughed, waving his hand. He explained that all market players see as a bankrupt company, but it holds enormous potential. The girl nodded obediently and asked how long they should observe the group. The longer the better. Liu Xin explained that the longer they waited to buy, the cheaper it would be. Pan Qian winced at the low price. He folded his arms across his chest, declaring gloomily that there was no time to waste in their situation. In the gaming industry, every second was precious. The girl suggested that in that case, all they had to do was sign a contract to purchase Shang Yang's company. Lucian thought for a few seconds. If the boss only needed one person, he would simply poach the developer. Peikan declared that he intended to buy the entire company and had no intention of changing anything. His assistant froze in surprise. Peikan grinned. He knew perfectly well that he would quickly lose money if he bought the company and let it slide. The man stood up from the table, asking to be driven to the internet cafe. Lucian bowed eagerly and said the car was ready. Jingzhou district was located on the other side of the city, so Pei Qian arrived there just as the sun was beginning to set. Assistant Shin remained near the car and watched with interest as the boss headed towards the entrance of the internet cafe. Ma Yan and Zhang Yuan were delighted to see the chef. The bartender asked the man if he had any drink preferences. Pei Qian looked around and thoughtfully said that he wouldn't mind a margarita right now. Everything was going as he'd planned. The room was completely empty. The man pretended to be surprised by the lack of customers. Ma Yan admitted, confused, that he himself didn't know what was going on. Perhaps it was because it was a day off. Pei Qian was so pleased he almost laughed. He nodded to his friend and reassured him that everything was fine. The man settled comfortably on the soft sofa and suggested closing early, as there would be no customers anyway. He asked the bartender to make everyone a cocktail. Free of charge. Zhang Yuan happily accepted the order. When the staff took the empty tables, the cafe was overcrowded. Pei Qian and his friends pulled 2 tables up to their sofa. Folding his arms across his chest, the man said he wanted to gradually open several more cafes in different parts of the city. He smiled and asked those employees who would like to apply for the position of branch manager to raise their hands. A forest of hands reached out from all sides. Even the cook impulsively raised his hand, then timidly extended his second, pointing his index finger upward. Seeing Zhang Yuan also raising his hand, Pei Qian smiled and said that he would promote him to the administrator anyway. The bartender couldn't believe his luck. He'd recently worked at a losing cafe and had already managed to get a promotion. Pei Qian selected 5 employees from the audience and asked Zhang Yuan to write down the names of the new internet cafe managers. The 2 friends exchanged glances. It was a bit unexpected. The guy behind them was bursting into tears, reproaching himself for his modesty. He'd simply been too shy to raise his hand. The cook also found it a little odd. He'd only been promoted to manager because he'd raised his hand along with everyone else. Pei Qian suddenly felt Ma Yan gently tug on his sleeve and turned to his friend in confusion. He whispered in his boss's ear that he wasn't entirely sure whether this was the right thing to do and that they'd better contact the employment center. The young man smiled at his friend and said in response that Ma Yan had hired all those people himself, so he simply trusted his choice. Ma Yan smiled sheepishly and scratched his head. It was all true. He was trying to recruit the best specialists for the cafe. Turning to Zhang Yuan, the man announced that he was appointing him as the manager of all internet cafes in Jingzhou. He turned to his friend and said that Ma Yan would be promoted to general manager. His friend smiled happily. Pei Qian raised his glass and announced that that wasn't all. Employees who didn't receive the managerial position would be given priority in the next selection process. The new managers joyfully raised their glasses to their boss. They were delighted that Pei Qian didn't promise, but delivered. They recently heard about the opening of new branches, and today their manager officially announced this. Placing his empty glass on the table, Pei Qian loudly declared that this was all for now. All employees could go home and rest. Several days passed after the meeting. On May the 4th, Pei Qian spent the morning working on issues and only arrived at the office around lunchtime. The Tengda Company's office was on the 17th floor, so the young man had little time to think about the situation. The man stepped out of the elevator, his jacket slung over his shoulder. He was very pleased with the amount of appliances he'd bought his parents, but that still wasn't enough. Pei Qian still had over 50,000 yuan left in his personal account. It needed to be spent quickly. The man walked slowly through the office, peering at his employees' screens. Suddenly he saw signs of hard work on one of them. Anticipating the worst, Pei Qian apprehensively asked Ming Liang if the content update plan was ready. The chief planner turned around and proudly announced that he had already done everything. A joyful smile lit his face. Pei Qian sternly suggested that the employee had worked on Labor Day for this very reason. The employee, frightened, said that was not the case. He knew he'd been caught. Min Liang admitted with a trembling voice that he had nothing to do at home, so he was thinking about ideas for renovations. The man angrily stated that working from home also counts as work, and reminded that overtime hours on holidays are paid triple. The chief planner nodded obediently. For a moment, he even thought his boss looked too threatening. Pei Qian waved his hand dismissively and said he'd forgive him for once. Ming Liang looked after the boss in surprise. During the meeting, The chief planner was still under the influence of his conversation with the boss and kept stumbling while reading the report. Peikan watched him closely. Ming Liang was the perfect employee. He was afraid of making a mistake. The only problem was the lack of budget. Baoshu listened to the speaker and exchanged glances with his boss. Peiqian immediately realized he didn't like this plan. Assistant Shin said that the plan seemed good in places, but it was too economical for the tasks at hand. The man waited until all the employees had expressed their opinions and then placed his notes on the table. He suggested adding a few more cards to the driving simulator. When Bao Shu heard that the card game also needed more generals, he thought he'd misheard. Carefully writing everything down in her notebook, Lin Wan asked how they could make the new quests in their latest game popular. Peiqian ordered the deadline to be doubled and another artist to be found. They needed to make more textures. Min Liang looked at his boss in bewilderment, trying to follow his thoughts. He had so many demands that the technical specifications seemed impossible to achieve. The man loudly declared that the meeting was over. They needed to get to work quickly to finish by June 18th. Min Liang checked his notes and timidly said that the updates might not pay for themselves. They would need to sell more than 100,000 copies. If there are 10 cards instead of 3, you will need to sell 400,000 upgrades to make a profit. Peiqian smiled happily and asked them not to worry. He said they should be treated fairly with the players, and they would reward them with hard cash. The employees began to quietly converse among themselves. Everyone was discussing potential losses and risks for the company. Each and also said it was a dubious idea. Lin Wan explained that players had already paid them a lot, so it would be fine to release a cheap product for them. Peiqian looked at his watch and impatiently announced that it was time for the employees to finally disperse and get to work. Within a minute, everyone was at their desks. Min Liang quickly assigned responsibilities to all the developers. On the morning of May the 6th, Zhang Yuan and Ma Yang were already sitting in the boss's office with a detailed report on the situation with the internet cafe. Zhang Yuan briskly announced that they had found 10 locations to choose from. He showed a photo of a shopping mall. The young man displayed the photograph on a large screen and explained that the location had been chosen very well, between the men's dormitory and the expensive houses. Peiqian didn't even look up. He knew this bustling area well, as he rented an apartment across the street. Zhang Wen noticed that the boss was acting very strangely, but pretended not to notice anything. He waved his hand at Ma Yan, mentally signaling that he should show the next slide. Ma Yan nodded slightly, confirming that he understood. Ma Yan ran his fingers over the keys on his laptop, searching for a better angle for the next location. Gesturing to the slide, Zhang Yuan explained that he had chosen a location to rent in a large shopping center. The cafe would be popular, as there are very few such places there. Peiqian only paused his gaze on the slide for a second, before suggesting that they continue the presentation. Zhang Yuan asked his friend to provide the next slide. Ma Yan nodded again and continued selecting slides. The newly appointed manager couldn't understand what was happening. His boss's strange silence made him tremble with fear. In fact, he took great care and carefully selected the first 3 rental spots. The remaining 7 were added for the sake of appearances. Peiqian summoned his assistant, Shin. She immediately arrived with a tray containing a hot teapot and cups. The man invited his subordinates to the table. He smiled politely after drinking tea and guessed that Zhang Yuan had spent a lot of time to find these 10 locations. The manager smiled joyfully. Inside, he was practically jumping for joy, proud that his efforts had not been in vain. Peiqian raised his left hand, curling his thumb. He admitted that the last 4 locations did indeed look quite good. Ma Yan sat silently on the sofa. Zhang Yuan froze in surprise. At first, he thought he'd misunderstood his boss. The new manager was furious. He couldn't believe Peiqian had chosen the worst locations, which had been added at random. Cheng Yan said, with a puzzled expression, that he had nothing against the boss's choice, but the first 3 places would be better for rent. The manager attempted a smile. He knew he couldn't simply say that the last few locations were a complete failure. Peiqian rose from his desk and looked thoughtfully at the last slide. He declared that the last 4 spots looked promising. Of course, finding an internet cafe in those locations won't be easy, but those who do find one will truly enjoy it. Ma Yan tried to convince his boss. He sat down on the sofa next to him and explained that he didn't want to open a cafe in a busy business district. Peiqian put his arm around his friend's shoulder and confidentially explained that the internet cafe shouldn't be like hundreds of others. Giving a thumbs up, the man explained that the cafe should be a quiet place where one can escape the hustle and bustle of the city. An overly noisy cafe would negatively impact their reputation. Cheng Yuan was only now beginning to understand the boss's grand plan. Of course, they shouldn't open their cafes next to dozens of others like them. Pei Tian thoughtfully told Ma Yan that those 4 locations were perfect. If they built a cafe there, customers would be able to clear their heads. This point perplexed Zhang Yuan. He understood perfectly well that the cafe's purpose was to squeeze money out of customers, not to provide them with peace and quiet. Noticing that the manager had risen from his seat and was about to say something, Pei Tian hurriedly announced that everything had been decided. They would set up a cafe in those 4 locations. The man turned his back on the managers and asked them to negotiate with the stores. If they needed money, they could contact Chin's assistant. Cheng Yuan silently spread his arms, trying to hint to his partner that he should try to convince his boss. He nodded. To the manager's surprise, Ma Yan quickly closed his laptop. He interpreted Yuan's gesture as complete agreement. Ma Yan joyfully exclaimed that there would be no problems. He and his partner would immediately get to work. Cheng Yuan nearly screamed in indignation. He couldn't believe his disagreement could be misinterpreted. Pei Tian walked to his desk and pulled out his chair. He said that in that case, he didn't want to detain the staff any longer. Smiling, the man announced that he was entrusting them with the leasing of the stores and wished them luck. If they needed additional funding, don't hesitate to ask. In reality, Pei Tian was gloating. When he wished his employees luck, he meant that they would spend as much money as possible on rent. The man stood by the transparent window, observing the office. The entire staff was working hard after yesterday's meeting. Shin's assistant entered the office. She suggested looking at the information they had obtained about Shangyang's company. Pei Tian took a sip and smiled happily. Of course, he wanted to hear news about that gaming company. The man sat down on the sofa to review the report. Hailu explained that Shangyang was working on 2 major games. The first game is an economic one, called Romantic Taoist. Pei Tian looked at the cover with a girl in rags. The second game was an MMORPG and, at first glance, looked just like the others. It was called Song of Bloody Battle. The young man thoughtfully took another sip. He realized that creating uninteresting content required talent. The very name of the first game was enough to turn off all customers. Assistant Shin said the second game was the company's main source of income, but sales have recently fallen. Pei Tian recalled that Tycoon had talked about the problems in the company after the designer put the sword up for sale. The girl said that office rent and employee salaries cost 350,000 yen per month, and no one had been paid this month. The man asked if there was anything else he should know about the company. He belatedly offered his assistant a seat. Hailey walked to the chair, thoughtfully saying that in such a case, there could be hidden risks, such as false contributions or capital withdrawal. She stated that the company's share capital, assets, and liabilities needed to be verified. Without this, it would be difficult to judge the purchase. The girl drew a small diagram and explained that the company was run by 2 people. Durougier owned 90% of the shares. Assistant Shin smiled. She was happy to inform him that they could wait a little longer and then buy the company for a couple 100,000 yen. Pei Tian asked in surprise why the company was so cheap. He'd been planning to spend at least a couple of million on the purchase. Hailio explained that in their situation, Ruijie couldn't raise the price. He was losing money. His only option was to sell the company. The girl added that employees were even promised that they would be paid in computers if the company was not bought. Pei Tian suddenly realized that Ruijie was a genius. He was getting rid of used computers in one fell swoop to avoid paying wages. Another hour passed. Jin's assistant continued to talk about the risks of buying another company. Finally, the girl closed her notes and raised her head, informing her boss that she had reported everything that needed to be taken into account when buying the company. She smiled and asked the man if he would like to initiate a covert investigation of the organization he was buying. Pei Tian scratched his chin in confusion and asked his assistant in bewilderment what kind of hidden check this was. Hailio suggested that they go to Shangyang anonymously, without revealing their identity, and observe the employees in their work environment. Pei Tian spread his hands, declaring that there was no point in doing that. The staff would still be dishonest, and the truth would eventually come out. Assistant Shin stood up and said that in that case, she would immediately contact the company's management and arrange a meeting. The young man folded his arms across his chest, raised his index finger, and asked to do it as quickly as possible. The assistant drove Pei Tian to Shangyang's company building. They rented an office in an old 8-story building. Hailey walked around the car to open the passenger door on the boss's side. The man surveyed the empty parking lot. He got out of the yellow SUV, still thinking that everything here seemed too gray and dull. Pei Tian, confused, said that this was the Shangyang company office. Assistant Shin confirmed the address was correct. A man came out of the building and extended his hand to the visitor, asking again if it was really Pei Tian. Wang Xiaobin introduced himself as the company's chief planner. He announced that Rui Jie was already waiting for guests upstairs. Pei Qian was puzzled when he remembered that Yi Kun had mentioned his friend Liu as the main planner. This was very strange. The young man began to regret missing the opportunity and not hiring Liu. He would have started suffering losses much sooner. Xiaobin was impressed that the visitor knew so much about their company and asked to follow him to the office. Compared to Pei Qian's office, the working conditions were worse, with employees' workstations simply separated by partitions. Xiaobin knocked on the director's door, where he was sitting on the sofa, and announced the arrival of visitors. He invited them in. Rijai happily extended his hand to the honored guest, sincerely admiring the young but very talented boss. Pei Qian shook his master's hand firmly and smiled, saying that was too much of a statement. Ruiji invited him to sit. When the boy and girl took the offered seats, Xiaobin entered the office with a tray and a teapot. Ruiji invited the chief planner to join the discussion. He would be the best person to talk about the company's games. The director admitted that he envies the rapid success of the Tengda company. Their games are very popular and in demand. Pei Qian smiled and waved his hand, stating that he was actually envious of the company's boss, Shang Yang. Rijai frowned in displeasure and took a sip of tea. The man asked what was there to envy in his situation. Pei Qian smiled and declared that he envied the company's success. He almost let it slip that he actually wished he could suffer the same failure. Rijai laughed, pleased with the guest's joke. He promised to hand over the company immediately if the young man could stabilize the situation. Placing a cup of rich green tea on the table, the man warned that he would like to discuss something right away. He and his partner have invested a lot of effort into this company. Secondly, all employees must be employed, even if Shang Yang collapses. For a moment, everyone remained silent. Shin's assistant was convinced that given these conditions, the company's acquisition should be postponed. Rijai laughed and declared he was even willing to compromise a little. He could remove 1 0 and sell the company for $1 million. Pei Qian said thoughtfully that Liu had once worked as the chief planner. The young man asked where he was now. Ruiji and Xiaobin immediately exchanged glances. They couldn't figure out where the man had gotten this information. Xiaobin quickly came to his senses and casually stated that the guy had quit a couple of days ago because he had found a new job. Rijai happily patted the employee on the shoulder, thus thanking him for getting him out of an awkward situation. He exclaimed that Xiaobin had worked as a planner for a long time and would be able to do the job even better than Liu. Pei Qian sighed in disappointment. This company had seemed quite promising to him, but now it was clear that it could still struggle. Besides, Xiaobin shouldn't become the chief planner. He doesn't need employees who know their stuff. Pei Qian said he would like to see Shang Yang's products and play their video games himself. Rijai asked the chief planner to bring a laptop with games installed. He hesitated briefly before agreeing. The young man began to understand everything. It seemed the boss of the company, which was suffering losses, had never played his own game before and didn't understand what was going on. Xiaobin opened the laptop in front of the visitor, but for some reason he couldn't remember the name of the first game for a long time. Pei Qian looked at the screen. He'd seen this screensaver before, with a shy beauty in torn clothes against a pink background. Pei Qian turned to the planner and said they had another game to play. Xiaobin, surprised, said he'd show them everything. There was nothing special about that MMORPG either. The controls were the same as in other online games. The young man took his cup of tea from the table, thinking with displeasure that it was simply tasteless. Such graphics were only appropriate for the Stone Age. Pei Qian took a sip with relish, thinking that he himself simply lacked imagination. Therefore, he couldn't afford to lose money. The man sighed, realizing he couldn't create anything as vile. It would take a special talent. Ruiji saw his guest's expression darken and began to worry about the outcome of their meeting. Everyone knew Pei Qian was an expert in games, and if he doesn't like any of the games, he'll have to lower the price. The thought brought a sweat to the company boss's face. To his surprise, Pei Qian quietly remarked that the games were quite good. Ruiji couldn't believe how well everything had worked out. The man was glad that the guest showed respect to him, and even squeezed out a good review of his disgusting games. Pei Qian grinned. He knew he couldn't create such a nasty thing himself. It would have to be left to true professionals. Seeing Pei Qian close his laptop, Assistant Shin looked at her boss with a puzzled expression, as if trying to reason with him. Opening her notes, she reminded Ruiji that game sales were declining and couldn't be considered assets. Besides, they didn't need the equipment they'd bought years ago. The man turned pale. Everything had been going well up until this point. He could have sold the company for more. The girl was clearly trying to lower the price. Hailu slammed her black diary shut. making it clear that she would have the final say. She firmly stated that taking into account all the above points, the Tengda company was ready to buy Shangyang for 550,000. Ruiji's face immediately darkened. It was too low a price. Unfortunately, he himself knew he couldn't get more. Peiqian noticed his interlocutor's uneasiness and gave him a high five, saying that he was willing to make a small concession and buy the company for 600,000. He sighed with relief. It wasn't the million he'd asked for earlier, but it was still better than nothing. He hastily agreed to sell the company, knowing full well that his assistant would not allow the price to be raised any further. The men shook hands. Peiqian, eager to finish as quickly as possible, impatiently asked to move on to signing the documents. Ruiji shook the buyer's hand and joyfully exclaimed that he did not expect any other outcome from such a big businessman. Assistant Shin sat next to Ruiji and asked to look at the contract. Peiqian smiled faintly. He asked Xiaobin to send his employees home until the official documents regarding the company's transfer were signed. The young man estimated that this would take about 4 days and said that the employees should return to work on Monday, May 10th. The chief planner joyfully exclaimed that he would inform everyone immediately. He was pleased with this turn of events. After Xiaobin left, Peiqian sat down in a chair. He had specifically ordered the employees to rest so they could get used to the company's work rhythm. He slowly took another sip, deciding that from now on, Shangyang's company would receive the same bonuses and salaries as the main company. All the documents were signed fairly quickly. Half an hour later, the yellow SUV was speeding back to the office. Peiqian lazily gazed out the window at the city. Suddenly his phone rang. He turned his head in surprise. It turned out that Huang Xibo had decided to tell him about the future of Fei Huang's workshop. The man looked out the window dejectedly. The interviewee cheerfully said that he wanted to continue filming the series and at the same time shoot another mini-series. Huang Xibo pointed at the screen and announced that the story would be about celebrities who have not forgotten their roots. Peiqian immediately remembered the announcer with a wooden mallet, who hosted a similar program on a popular TV channel. He cried out indignantly that Huang Xibo was simply trying to copy 2 Chinese TV programs. He imagined himself as a hero, being swept away by high waves on a cliff, and declared that he intended to follow his dream. Hearing that director Zhu wanted to make a documentary series, the young man wiped his forehead in relief. He knew it was definitely a bad idea. Peiqian smiled and promised his interlocutor to support him. Huang Xibo happily thanked his boss. After finishing the conversation, the young man asked Shin's assistant how things would develop with the Shangyang games. She smiled. Looking at the boss in the rearview mirror, Hailu suggested meeting with the new employees on Monday and issuing technical assignments. Peiqian scratched his chin and thoughtfully asked if he needed to come to the office himself on Monday. While continuing to drive, the assistant explained that the boss should see his subordinates more often. Otherwise, they would become unmanageable. The young man smiled. He understood what was needed for bankruptcy. Peiqian asked to pick him up on Monday morning. Monday arrived. Shangyang's staff had regained their strength over the past 4 days and returned to their office. They were heatedly discussing the purchase of their company. Everyone was happy that they were keeping their jobs. Only Xiaobin was saddened. He intended to tell his new boss that he couldn't work as chief planner. The young man clutched his head. This position was too much for him. It would be better if someone else were appointed chief planner. The developer's fingers at the next desk were tirelessly running across the keys. Xiaobin couldn't stand the constant noise any longer and covered his ears with his hands. At this time, Yikun called his friend Jizhou and asked him if anyone from Tengda Company had contacted him. He just smiled. The parent company's staff simply didn't care about the subsidiary. Jizhou said he hadn't heard about it. The writer stated in surprise that the new boss had promised to employ all the new employees. Apparently, the man had simply forgotten about him. Jizhou burst into loud laughter, swaying as he explained that Peiqian had completely bought their company. Yichun closed his eyes, trying to understand what the new boss meant when he said that no one would be left without work. The thought occurred to the guy that everyone in Shangyang's company was as talented as he and Huang Xibo, but he immediately discarded it. There was no need to lie to himself. Yichun said he couldn't talk much. Peiqian was supposed to be coming to their office soon. Jizhou ended the call, puzzled. After this conversation, nothing cleared up in the writer's mind. In fact, he began to look even more perplexed. The double door to the office opened. Peiqian and his assistant, Shin, appeared in the doorway. The room was illuminated by bright light. The man walked ahead at a brisk pace, his black tie fluttering as he walked briskly. Hailu followed behind him with her notes. Zhizhou was the first to realize who had come to their office and readily rose from his desk. Peiqian adjusted his tie as he walked and casually put his hand in his pocket to give the impression of a relaxed boss. Assistant Shin caught up with him. The young men approached the staff, smiling happily. Xiaobin thought with admiration that the new boss knew how to make an impression despite his young age. Zhizhou couldn't hide his admiration. He thought this was exactly how a boss should look. Everyone considered Ruijie simply a rich, arrogant man. Peiqian smiled and glanced around before proposing to begin the meeting. The assistant smiled warmly at the new employees. Zhizhou and Xiaobin couldn't take their eyes off their boss. Now they understood what a genius developer should look like. The man immediately disliked the conference room. Instead of one large table, there were about a dozen smaller ones pushed close together. Moreover, the chairs were extremely uncomfortable. Peiqian realized that Ruijie had simply skimped and bought the cheapest office furniture. He decided to update the workstations and spend some money on it. The man cleared his throat into his fist, calling for silence. All the employees stared at the new boss with interest. Peiqian declared that he would only talk about the most important things. The girls and boys looked so young, as if Shang Yang was recruiting yesterday's students into her ranks. Peiqian looked at all the employees and suddenly asked with a smile which one of them was named Ye Jizhou. The young man pointed at himself in bewilderment. His neighbor looked at his employee with interest. Zhizhou quickly stood up and raised his hand, declaring it was him. The young man didn't understand why his name had been mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. Peiqian waved his hand, asking the boy to sit down. He said there was no need to stand up during the meeting. The new boss told Xiaobin that he was taking him into his company, and the position of chief planner would go to Jizhou. Xiaobin couldn't believe it. Just a few minutes ago, he himself was about to tell Peiqian that he couldn't fulfill his duties. He smiled happily, thanking his boss for the new assignment. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the guy's shoulders, and his life was beginning to improve. Peiqian's face darkened, suspecting he'd made a mistake. He'd expected the chief planner to beg him to stay in his position. Chichu also noticed that Xiaobin was overly happy about losing his position, which was very strange. Peiqian looked at the reactions of the other employees. They continued to quietly converse among themselves, as was expected. The two girls immediately began to gossip in whispers, and the employees near them also quietly talked among themselves. The man was generally pleased with the staff's reaction. He decided to escalate the situation a bit further, grinning maliciously. Peiqian imagined himself as an emperor in golden and black robes, sitting on the throne, and called the courtier Jizhou to him. The boss allowed the guy to fire employees every month without any reason. He just needed to send him an email. Jizhou looked at the emperor in bewilderment. Only 18 steps separated them, but the distance was insurmountable. After climbing a few steps, the boy received a sword in its sheath. He couldn't understand the merits for which he had been awarded such power. Peiqian had his reasons. He hoped that Jizhou's incompetence would sow chaos within the team and lead to unrest. The man mentally calculated his entire cunning plan in his head and nodded slightly to himself with a smile. Everything should work out. Peiqian stated that he intends to retain only one in-game purchase option instead of several. Jizhou will also be responsible for this. He stood up from his seat in surprise and promised that he would personally oversee the implementation of the technical assignment. The boss looked at the employees and said that each of them had to submit a proposal for a new game with sketches. Xiaobin looked at the man in surprise. Everyone was busy here. No one was proposing new projects. Peiqian announced that the meeting was over. He looked around at the staff and asked if anyone had any questions. Jizhou timidly raised his hand and quietly said he'd like to clarify something. The boss thanked everyone for their attention and dismissed the staff. The developers were surprised. The new boss had said he'd only touch on the main points, and he really did. After the meeting, everyone returned to the office and got to work. At first, they talked only about their meeting. One of the guys, perplexed, told his neighbor that Jizhou had the least experience in the company. The neighbor asked him to keep his voice down. Xiaobin stopped next to Jizhou, cup in hand. The boy pretended not to notice and continued working. Xiaobin sighed heavily, assuming that the guy would be the deputy boss for a while, since he had such extensive powers. Jizhou himself wasn't happy with the weight of the responsibilities he'd been given. He had no idea how he'd cope. The young man contacted Yi Kun again, but couldn't bring himself to tell him about the meeting. He encouraged his friend and promised to help if needed. Jizhou sighed wearily and reluctantly admitted, scratching his head, that Peiqian had appointed him to the position of chief planner at the meeting. Yi Kun was now even more confused. He couldn't understand why the boss had done this. But first, he'd forgotten his promise. Then he'd appointed an inexperienced employee to a high-ranking position. He recalled changing several positions with Huang Xibo, who only managed to become chief planner at Tengda. Chicho had been assisting Yi Kun and Shang Yang's company all this time, but now he himself instantly became the main planner. Yi Chun clutched his head. Everyone around him became a master planner, but luck stubbornly eluded him. Chijo admitted that he didn't really want the job and asked to talk to his boss about finding a replacement. Yi Chun instantly became angry. Such a chance doesn't come every day, and he still doubts his own incompetence. He angrily said goodbye to his friend. Jijo shouted after him that he wouldn't be able to handle it. He was a newcomer to the industry. The guy worriedly said that the responsibility was too great. He was afraid of doing something wrong and ruining everything. Yikun smiled upon hearing these words and scratched his chin thoughtfully. If his friend was so concerned about the company, he must have potential. After thinking it over carefully, Yikun decided to share his observations with his friend. He needed to hear it. He asked Jijo if he knew Huang Xibo, who had worked there before Jijo joined the company. He hadn't even heard of the name. Yikun exclaimed that Huang Xibo was the executive director here, but in Tengda Company, he became the chief planner. Jijo let out a surprised cry when he learned that Huang Xibo was still working on that very same ocean fortress. Yikun pointed his finger at his interlocutor, saying that Pei Qian promoted many employees precisely because he saw talent in them. The guy spoke so confidently and penetratingly that Jijo even felt like a bright light was shining on him from the heavens. He looked at his palms with interest, deciding that most likely the boss saw untapped potential in him. The young man felt the light growing brighter. The only thing that surprised him was that he himself had been unaware of his talent. Yichun exclaimed that there was no need to worry. If Pei Qian said someone could do something, it meant it would happen. Chicho thanked his friend for his advice. Now he was confident that his position as chief planner had been well-deserved. The young man realized that he had been granted such great power for a reason. He had no right to retreat. His fingers moved even more confidently across the keyboard. The employees of Shangyang's company had already discussed the latest news with each other and were now working silently at their desks. Xiaobin couldn't sit still and came back to Jijo with a cup. Jijo turned around in surprise. The young man silently moved his chair closer to his neighbor, making it clear that the conversation would not be short. Xiaobin quietly asked how the chief planner intended to resolve the donation issue that the boss had mentioned. He admitted he had a couple of ideas. Everyone knows about the quality of games, and some problems are very difficult to fix. Xiaobin looked at his colleague in bewilderment, pushing his glasses up his nose. He held several sheets of paper in his hands. Chicho exclaimed triumphantly that Pei Qian himself had hinted that these problems could be solved through in-game purchases. The interviewer sighed, saying it wouldn't be easy. You can't just remove the game store. Using the example of the romantic Taoist, Xiaobin clearly demonstrated that buyers must have a number of advantages over other players. The same rule applies to MMORPGs. If you remove the store, you have to recalculate the entire game economy. Zhou proposed introducing a new indicator of player strength. He said it could very well be timing or luck. Xiaobin replied that in that case, players would start competing against each other in time and would have to create a new game. The young people simultaneously bowed their heads and sighed dejectedly. They couldn't come up with anything worthwhile. Zhou suddenly perked up, a brilliant idea having occurred to him. He couldn't understand how he hadn't thought of it before. The young man joyfully exclaimed that he'd thought of everything. He slyly asked his friend how Xiaobin felt about anyone being able to donate. He stood up from his chair in surprise, asking the chief planner in bewilderment how anyone could become a millionaire. The young man proudly showed 3 fingers, explaining that he intended to divide the entire gaming experience into 3 different stages. Donators in heavy armor spend a lot of money. They have tremendous strength, which allows them to fight several opponents at once. Organizers who spend a lot of time in the game will have the opportunity to manage guilds and invite new members. The 3rd level would be the regular players. Xiaobin got the idea. These groups differed only in the amount of money invested. If you remove the ability to make in-game purchases from the game, all players will be roughly equal in strength and chaos will ensue. Chicho revealed that they will randomly select players who will receive combat power, previously only available to donators. Xiaobin exclaimed admiringly that this was a wonderful idea. He added that the chance of becoming the chosen one could be increased by being active in the game. The lead planner stated that he had met the boss's demands. They would preserve the gameplay and remove in-game purchases. Xiaobin promised to quickly model their plan. He suggested calling a meeting and briefly explaining it to the others. Zuchou stood up, raised his hand, and loudly asked all the employees to gather in the meeting room. Peikin was relaxing on a comfortable sofa at home when he was suddenly awakened by a notification on his phone. It turned out that Zai Jie was worried about the players. If they were deprived of their donations, they might quit the game. The man suggested that Rui Jie return the players' money. Peikin laughed, delighted with his own idea. He wouldn't be offended if several hundred donors left the game. The young man sat down on the sofa and cheerfully told himself that donators could either become honest players or leave the game. After rereading the message a few more times, Pei Qian wrote back that players should decide for themselves how to play further. With a sense of accomplishment, the young man collapsed onto the sofa, closing his eyes. He knew this decision would hasten the company's demise. Wondering if Jicho would send another question, Pei Qian opened his eyes and stared at his phone screen. At this time, the employees of Shangyang's company were eagerly awaiting their boss's response in the meeting room. The most worried of all was Jicho himself. He sat in the boss's seat, staring fixedly at his phone screen. As soon as Xiaobin heard the notification sound, he happily walked up to the employee and asked what Pei Qian had answered. Zhizhou spent a few seconds trying to understand the message. It contained only one word, open to interpretation. The man who initiated the meeting silently showed his friend the answer, asking him to figure out for himself what the boss meant. Xiaobin stared intently at the phone screen, as if hoping to read a secret message between the lines. He handed the phone back to its owner, puzzled. Zhizhou continued to ponder how to interpret Pei Yan's answer. Xiaobin helped him with this and stated that in fact, just one word contained the great wisdom of their boss. He turned to the rest of the staff and explained that Pei Qian had helped resolve the issue with the donors by writing that it would be so. When the members of the meeting learned that the boss had written a single word, their faces simultaneously stretched out in bewilderment. The insightful Xiaobin clarified Pei Qian's message. The boss thus demonstrated that they shouldn't care whether the game changes would be liked by backers. Zhizhou looked at his friend with gratitude. He would not have been able to understand his boss's wise plan so deeply. Zhizhou added that these changes will only affect the new server. Donators will be able to play on the previous version and enjoy all the benefits. One of the meeting participants raised his hand and asked how this issue could be resolved. After that, many would simply stop playing. Xiaobin smiled and said that there was no other way. They needed to remove the donation option anyway. The young man angrily slammed his fist on the table and shouted that they were fighting a tyrant for territory and should not think about his feelings. Chichu took up his friend's idea and shook his fist menacingly, declaring that from now on, all players should rely only on their own strength. Xiaobin imagined the boss cutting through the dense thickets with a single swing of his sword and explained that the difference in experience and skill was too great. Xiaobin declared he had said all he wanted to and sat down. Zhizhou followed suit and sank into his chair as well. Xiaobin smiled at the members of the meeting and asked who else could boast such charisma as their boss. Zhizhou smiled warmly. He summed up the meeting, stating that all issues had been resolved, so it was time to get back to work as soon as possible. Xiaobin and Zhizhou were the last to leave the conference room. Zhizhou vowed to himself that he would carry out his boss's orders and restore the company's good name. Ma Yan tried his best to attract customers to the cafe. Flame-shaped colored glass created the illusion of a fire in the evening. There were few customers that evening. The waiters yawned lazily and fiddled with their mobile phones out of boredom. Cheng Yuan tried to salvage the situation by performing on stage with a guitar. Unfortunately, the audience showed little interest. Ma Yan glanced around the room and sighed. He realized it was time to close. He couldn't expect any more customers that evening. Suddenly, the man noticed movement on the street and turned his head in confusion. He realized that not all was lost. A guy with a guitar slung over his back peered curiously through the window into the cafe. The manager decided to convince him to come in. Ma Yan opened the door and asked if the stranger wanted to play. He waved his hands. The young man suggested they at least come in for a drink. Chen Lei hesitated for a few seconds and asked shyly if the internet cafe needed a singer. He pointed at the stage with Zhang Yuan and confidently declared that he could perform better if he was given a chance to try. Ma Yan scratched his chin thoughtfully. The proposal was interesting. Zhang Yuan, as a regional manager, didn't get to speak often. The man invited the visitor inside for now. Chen Lei noticed that the bar was luxuriously furnished. Ma Yan smiled and asked the stranger's name. A little embarrassed, Chen Lei introduced himself. The man invited him onto the stage. The guitarist bowed and followed him between the empty tables. Zhang Yuan was so surprised by the appearance of a stranger with a guitar on stage that he immediately stopped playing and went down to his friend. He asked what was going on. Ma Yan explained that he'd decided to hire a singer so his friend could relax more. Chenlei slowly moved the bar stool and microphone closer to the edge of the stage and settled himself comfortably. Friends watched the singer. Before striking the first chords, the man carefully checked the tuning of the strings and microphone. Chenlin played ordinary songs, like all performers, but his voice somehow attracted people to it. The patrons, who had been lazily sipping beer at the tables, began to turn towards the stage with interest. Ma Yan smiled and lied to his friend that the guy wasn't a very good singer. Zhang Yuan declared that this singer sang songs much better. He explained that a true voice is very difficult to find and that it can be considered a gift from the gods. Chenlei was fortunate in this regard. Zhang Yuan asked to look at the visitors. Only now did Ma Yan notice the genuine delight in their eyes. Raising his glass, the bartender asked where Ma Yan had found this guy. He admitted that Chenlei had heard a pop song and decided to stop in because he could do better. These words struck him straight in the heart like a sharp knife. Ma Yan laughed, thanking his friend for the new singer's arrival. Zhang Yuan angrily clutched his head and said he'd changed his mind. This guy was completely unsuitable for the singer's job. The other man laughed. He understood. Work was in full swing in Shangyang's office. By Tuesday, May 18th, many revisions had been made. Xiaobin approached the chief planner and asked if everything was ready. Zhizhou continued working on the corrections. He said he'd fixed everything. In reality, all he'd really done was remove all the paid cards from the game. Xiaobin pulled up a chair and sat next to the chief planner, curious to see what the game looked like now. Zhizhou shared statistics on the game servers. It's only been a few days since the patches were implemented, so it's too early to judge. Xiaobin noted that few people pay attention to the romantic Taoist. Everyone is more interested in MMORPGs. Zhizhou sheepishly explained that he had recalculated the game's economy. Now, players would have to pay 10 yuan per day. The interviewer asked what was bothering him. The chief planner sighed. He admitted that he was very worried. With a heavy sigh, Zhizhou explained that they had changed a lot in the games, but none of the developers had any experience to draw on. Xiaobin smiled good-naturedly and asked if it really bothered his friend so much. He nodded sheepishly. Zhizhou poked his forehead thoughtfully and remarked that Xiaobin had far more experience. He asked if their plan would work. Xiaobin looked at his friend with a smile. He couldn't believe Zhizhou was worried about such trivial things. The man firmly stated that Zhizhou was now the chief planner and shouldn't seek advice from the others. He asked if the boy remembered Tengda's last game. Zhizhou was surprised to hear that the other's advice sounded very much like the plot of that game. They would only be a distraction. Xiaobin placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, encouraging him. He knew he couldn't let the boy break down at such a crucial moment. The man stated that it was perfectly acceptable to be confused about the decisions. One simply had to remember the task assigned by Pei Qian. Zhizhou finally understood and smiled. He didn't need to worry about success. He simply needed to follow his boss's orders without fail. The chief planner stood up and raised his hand, loudly demanding that everyone do a final check before the update. The latest changes didn't please longtime players. Rumors circulated on the server that the game would soon be shut down. Some people didn't understand why everything became available for free and explained that they had decided to expel the donors first. One of the players thoughtfully mentioned that some purchases were still possible. A stamina potion would cost 100 ingots. The woman in the gold robe with red accents countered that it was very little. 10 yuan a day couldn't be considered a donation. During the discussion, another player approached them. He listened intently to the conversation and learned that on the new server, all players would be equal. The gray-haired man explained that that's not all. Every now and then, a randomly selected player with advanced skills will appear among them. The girl liked the idea. She exclaimed that in that case, she would be able to attack 10 people if she became the chosen one. New players approached them and joined the conversation. One player thought it was time to sell his account and try another server. These conversations deeply shocked Zhizhou. He believed that players would simply quit the game and not move to the new server. The chief planner approached Xiaobing with important news and waved. He turned his head and inquired about the players' reactions. Zhizhou announced that the gaming community was eagerly awaiting a new server. Xiaobin smiled and promised to create one right away. The lead planner was pleased. The new server was already created. All that was left was to log in and see how the players reacted. While the game's textures were loading, Zhizhou managed to pray that new players wouldn't curse the development team to the 7th generation. The very first messages on the forum surprised the young man. He realized that there were still many players despite the removal of the donation option. Xiaobin stood up angrily and slammed his palm on the table. Something unthinkable had happened. There were so many players that they had overloaded the new server. Zhuzhou confirmed his fears and raised his hand, shouting that another game server needed to be created quickly. Xiaobin smiled slyly. He decided to build a script into the game that would automatically add a new server when the current one became full. He was glad that the players liked the new server, but he couldn't believe that it was due to their latest innovations. Zhuzhou raised his hand and asked the developers to test the new server. The best way would be to join a guild and chat,